At noon, the world should be bright, the fields should shimmer under a hard white sun, the sea should flash like broken metal, and the stones of cities should hold the heat of the day. But in the year 536, something is wrong with the sky. The sun rises, yet it does not seem to arrive. It hangs there pale and weakened, more like a lamp behind dirty glass than the power that governs seasons, harvests, and human time. Shadows lose their edges. The air feels thin and strange. Summer does not behave like summer. In some places, frost comes when it should not. In others, the cold creeps into the bones of farmers who have no words for a planet wrapped in volcanic dust. People look upward because there is nowhere else to look. They do not know about sulfate particles drifting high in the stratosphere. They do not know that ice, buried for centuries in Greenland and Antarctica, will one day preserve chemical traces of catastrophe. They only know that the sun has dimmed, and that this is not how the world is supposed to work. A strange fear moves through villages, ports, monasteries, imperial courts, and roads lined with hungry travellers. In a world where rulers claim divine favour and priests read meaning in the heavens, a failing sun is not weather. It feels like judgment. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, what makes this moment so haunting is not simply that the sky darkens. Eclipses are frightening, but they pass. Storms are violent, but they move on. This dimness lingers. What survives in the record suggests not an hour of terror, but months of unease, a long season in which people wake each morning hoping the familiar world has returned, only to find the same weak light spreading over the same anxious ground. Crops do not respond to hope. Grain needs warmth. Vines need seasons. Animals need fodder. Empires need taxes. Armies need bread. Cities need shipments. And the entire machinery of civilization depends on a quiet assumption that the sun will keep its ancient bargain. The day the sun disappears is not truly one day. It is a slow theft. Light is taken first, then warmth, then harvest, then confidence. The disaster does not strike like an army at the gates. It enters through the sky, through the soil, through empty storage jars, through rumours carried by traders and soldiers, somewhere far away, perhaps in the far north, perhaps in the tropics, perhaps from a volcano whose scars are still debated. An eruption has thrown enough material into the upper atmosphere to blur the engine of climate itself. But for the people living beneath that veil, the cause is invisible. The effect is everywhere. Imagine a farmer standing in a field that should be green and strong by early summer, watching shoots struggle in soil too cold to trust. Imagine a ship captain entering harbour beneath a sun that gives little warmth, hearing that inland markets are already tense. Imagine an official in Constantinople calculating grain supplies while imperial ambition stretches across the Mediterranean. Imagine a monk writing by dim daylight, not yet knowing that his brief note may become one of the most important witnesses to a planetary disturbance. These people do not understand themselves as living through a climate event. They are living through signs. And signs matter in late antiquity. The world of the 6th century is a world of empires, kingdoms, bishops, merchants, soldiers, farmers, and refugees. But it is also a world of interpretation. Comets, eclipses, earthquakes, droughts, and plagues are rarely just physical events. They are warnings, punishments, omens, disturbances in the moral order of the universe. A darkened sun presses on the imagination because it seems to violate the hierarchy of creation. The sun is not a minor object. It is the clock of God, the measure of labour, the guarantor of ripening fields. When it weakens, everything beneath it feels less certain. Yet the most unsettling part is that this fear was not imaginary. Behind the dread was a real environmental shock, one of the sharpest short-term cooling events of the last 2,000 years. Tree rings from different regions show years of stunted growth. Ice cores preserve traces of volcanic fallout. Written records from parts of the Mediterranean and beyond describe abnormal skies and failing seasons. No single source tells the whole story, and scholars still debate the exact eruption, or eruptions that caused it. But the pattern is difficult to dismiss. Something vast happened above the clouds, and human societies below were forced to absorb the consequences. This is where the mystery becomes larger than a strange sky. The 6th century was already strained. The Roman world had not vanished, but it had changed. In the east, the empire still rules from Constantinople, wealthy, ambitious, and determined to reclaim lost Western territories. In the west, new kingdoms sit amid the ruins as continuities of Roman power. Trade still moves, armies still march, churches rise, coins circulate, and cities endure. But beneath the surface, the world is not as stable as marble monuments suggest. War drains resources, taxation bites deeply, borders shift, populations move. Then the sky itself seems to turn against them. The dim sun becomes a test. Some societies bend, some fracture, some transform in ways that later generations mistake for sudden collapse. The climate shock of 536 does not act alone, and no careful historian can say that one dark year simply destroyed empires. The evidence remains incomplete, and the ancient world is too complex for a single cause. But disasters do not need to create every weakness. Sometimes they reveal weaknesses already waiting. Sometimes they arrive when the walls are cracked, the granaries are low, the roads are dangerous, and the rulers are asking too much of people who have too little left to give. Across the Mediterranean, the great imperial dream of Justinian is unfolding under this altered sky. His armies fight to restore Roman control in the west. His builders raise monuments of astonishing beauty. His laws aim to shape an empire that can outlast him. But ambition requires a predictable world, and the 6th century is becoming anything but predictable. In the years after the dimming, famine and disease begin to move through history with terrible force. The Justinianic plague will soon tear through populations, leaving behind records of death so immense that even allowing for exaggeration, the trauma is unmistakable. Whether climate helped prepare the ground for plague remains debated, but the timing is chilling. The story, then, is not only about darkness, it is about connection. A volcano erupts, and particles rise beyond human sight. Sunlight scatters, temperatures fall, trees grow less, harvests weaken, food prices rise, bodies become vulnerable, armies strain supply lines, cities crowd the hungry and the sick, rulers demand order from a world slipping out of rhythm. Chroniclers try to explain what they see with the language they possess. Centuries later, scientists drill into ice and read the sky's memory and frozen chemistry. The ancient fear and the modern evidence begin to meet. There is something almost unbearable in that meeting. The people of 536 looked up and saw a mystery. We look down into ice and wood and sediment and begin to see a mechanism. But understanding the mechanism does not make the human experience smaller. It makes it sharper. It reminds us that civilizations are not separate from atmosphere, soil, microbes, rainfall, and temperature. They are built inside them: palaces, laws, armies, and sacred texts all exist under weather. When the light changes, history changes with it. For those who lived through it, the sun did not vanish completely. That may have made it worse. A vanished sun would be apocalypse in a single image. A weakened sun is uncertainty. It asks people to continue living while the rules fail quietly around them. They still sow fields. They still pray. They still trade, bury, marry, tax, flee, command, and endure. But each ordinary action takes place under a sky that seems to be withholding its promise. The world has not ended. Yet it no longer feels reliable. And from that uneasy light, the story begins not with an empire falling in one dramatic crash, but with a veil drawn across the heavens, a cold breath moving through summer, and human beings discovering that even the strongest kingdoms stand beneath a sky they cannot command. Before the sky turns pale, the world is already carrying more weight than it can easily admit. Late antiquity is often imagined as an age of endings, a dim corridor between the grandeur of Rome and the medieval centuries that follow. But to the people living through the early 6th century, the world is not simply collapsing. It is busy, crowded, contested, and alive with ambition. Ships cross the Mediterranean with grain, wine, oil, papyrus, timber, slaves, spices, silk, and news. Roads still carry officials and soldiers. Churches rise where temples once stood. Markets hum beside old walls. In Constantinople, the imperial capital gleams with wealth and ceremony, its domes and palaces looking out over waters that connect Europe and Asia. The Roman Empire has changed its shape, but it has not lost its belief in destiny. That belief matters because the age before the darkened sun is not an age of quiet resignation. It is an age of projects. Justinian, ruling from Constantinople, sees himself not as the caretaker of a reduced Eastern Empire, but as the emperor of a Roman world that can be repaired. Lost provinces in North Africa and Italy are not, in his mind, permanently lost. They are wounds in the imperial body. His generals, especially Belisarius, move across the sea with disciplined armies and astonishing confidence. In 533, just a few years before the mysterious dimming, the Vandal kingdom in North Africa falls with startling speed. Carthage returns to imperial control. To many observers, it must seem as if history has reversed direction. But restoration is expensive. Armies do not live on glory. They need ships, horses, metal, pay, fodder, and above all food. Every campaign pulls on the countryside. Every victory creates new administrative burdens. Every reclaimed province must be defended, taxed, supplied, and integrated. The empire's strength is real, but it depends on a delicate chain of extraction and movement. Grain from Egypt and other fertile regions feeds cities and soldiers. Taxes collected in coin and kind pass through layers of bureaucracy. Merchants rely on safe seas. Officials rely on predictable harvests. The system is impressive, but it is also hungry. It can absorb ordinary trouble. It is far less clear how well it can absorb several disasters arriving together. Beyond the empire's borders, other powers watch, adapt, and resist. In Italy, the Ostrogothic kingdom rules from cities still heavy with Roman memory. In Gaul, Frankish kings expand through war, marriage, and opportunism. In Spain, Visigothic rulers govern a land of Roman cities, local aristocrats, and religious tensions. Across the Danube and the steppe, shifting alliances and migrations keep imperial commanders alert. To the east, the Sasanian Empire stands as Rome's great rival, wealthy, sophisticated, and dangerous. Neither Rome nor Persia can easily destroy the other, but both can exhaust themselves trying. The frontier between them is not only a military line, it is a pressure belt where diplomacy, tribute, fortresses, raids, and religion constantly interact. The landscape beneath these powers is equally complex. Much of the ancient economy still depends on small farmers, tenant labourers, estate workers, herders, and village communities whose names rarely survive. Their lives are tied to local rhythms: rain at the right time, frost at the expected time, harvest before rot, enough surplus to pay obligations and still survive winter. Cities may display the face of civilization, but the countryside feeds it. A bad harvest is not merely a private tragedy. It becomes a fiscal problem, a military problem, a religious problem, and sometimes a political one. The evidence remains incomplete, because ordinary hunger leaves fewer monuments than emperors do, but what survives in law codes, tax records, letters, and later chronicles suggest that rural life could be squeezed hard even in normal years. There's also a quieter environmental fragility that ancient people cannot measure but know intimately. Mediterranean farming is always a negotiation with uncertainty. Too little rain, and grain withers. Too much rain at the wrong moment, and fields rot. A late frost can damage vines and fruit trees. A cool growing season can shorten yields. Farmers diversify where they can, storing grain, keeping animals, planting different crops, relying on kin, landlords, monasteries, markets, and patrons. But resilience has limits. If one valley fails, grain can sometimes be brought from another. If a whole region fails, prices rise. If several regions suffer together, the old safety nets begin to tear. This is why the 6th century's world is so vulnerable to a wounded sun. It is not primitive, and it is not helpless. In many ways it is deeply capable. It has ports, laws, long-distance commerce, taxation, shipbuilding, diplomacy, and institutions that can move resources across astonishing distances. But those strengths depend on coordination, and coordination depends on stability. The more connected the world becomes, the more a shock in one place can travel. A failed harvest can become a food crisis in a city. A food crisis can become unrest. Unrest can weaken tax collection. Weak tax collection can undermine armies. Weak armies can invite enemies. No single explanation fully accounts for this chain, because every region experiences it differently, but the pattern is familiar across history. Then there is the spiritual atmosphere of the age. Christianity has become central to imperial identity, public authority, and daily imagination, but it has not made the world simpler. Bishops argue over doctrine with a seriousness that modern readers sometimes underestimate. Theological disputes are also political disputes, social disputes, and questions of belonging. Imperial attempts to enforce religious unity can generate resentment, especially in provinces where local Christian traditions do not align neatly with Constantinople. At the same time, older habits of omen reading and cosmic interpretation do not disappear overnight. People may worship in churches, but they still live in a universe where the sky speaks. An unnatural sun is therefore not just a physical irregularity, it enters a world already trained to search the heavens for meaning. One lesser-known detail of this period is how much communication still binds distant places together. News can travel slowly, but not randomly. A merchant from Alexandria hears of prices in Constantinople. A soldier from Thrace carries rumours into Italy. A cleric copies a letter. A traveller brings word of war, famine, miracle, or plague. The ancient world is not globally connected in the modern sense, yet it is far from isolated. When atmospheric change spreads across the northern hemisphere, reports of strange weather do not remain local curiosities. They enter networks of explanation. A dim sun in one region may be described differently in another, but the unease travels with ships, pilgrims, envoys, and refugees. By the early 530s, the Eastern Roman Empire appears powerful enough to reshape the Mediterranean. That appearance is not false. Justinian's government can mobilize armies, commission vast buildings, reform law, and intervene across the sea. But power at this scale creates its own exposure. The empire is like a great bronze mechanism with many gears turning at once. It can do extraordinary things as long as the gears remain aligned. War in Africa, war in Italy, tension with Persia, religious conflict, urban dependence on imported food, rural tax burdens, and climatic uncertainty all place stress on the machinery. When the sky darkens, it does not strike a peaceful world. It strikes a world in motion. And motion can hide danger. The early victories of Justinian may have encouraged the belief that the old Roman order still had enough strength to gather itself and expand. Carthage had been reclaimed. Italy seemed reachable. The law was being organized into a monumental imperial vision. Constantinople stood as a city of ceremony and stone, surrounded by walls that made it one of the most formidable urban centers on earth. Yet beneath the confidence is a dependence on things no emperor can decree: sunlight, rainfall, harvest, health, and the invisible balance between humans and disease. The empire can command men to march. It cannot command wheat to ripen in cold fields. The same is true beyond Rome. The Franks, Goths, Persians, and countless smaller communities all depend on environmental regularity in ways their rulers rarely acknowledge. A kingdom may celebrate conquest, but its strength still rests in barns, herds, granaries, and seasonal labor. The apparent solidity of political power is built on biological softness: plants growing, animals breeding, children surviving, bodies resisting illness. When conditions shift, the map does not change immediately. Borders remain drawn, titles remain spoken, coins still bear rulers' names, but the deeper foundations begin to tremble. So before the sun fades into that eerie, weakened disk, the 6th century world stands at a strange height. It is not the old Roman world of Augustus, but neither is it a ruin. It is a transformed, ambitious, interconnected, late antique world, capable of restoration and violence, learning and cruelty, faith and calculation. It has survived invasions, civil wars, religious upheaval, and political fragmentation. It has learned to adapt, yet it has also become stretched thin by its own ambitions and dependencies. When the veil crosses the sky, it will not create every crisis that follows. It will find crises already forming, and it will give them a colder, darker season in which to grow. The first sign is not fire, not thunder, not a mountain breaking open before human eyes. For most people, the catastrophe arrives as absence. The sun is present, but diminished. Daylight spreads, but weakly. Warmth should gather across the land, yet it seems delayed, hesitant, almost withheld. In the language of those who watch it happen, the sun gives light without brightness, as if its force has been drained. That image survives because it is simple and terrifying. The sky does not need to fall to announce disaster. It only needs to stop behaving like the sky. In the year 536 across parts of the Mediterranean world, observers begin to notice that the daylight has changed. The most famous written accounts come from men who are already trained to record unusual events: historians, chroniclers, officials, and church writers. They describe a sun that shines dimly for an extended period, a year in which the usual brilliance of the heavens seems muted. The evidence remains incomplete, and ancient reports are never as precise as modern instruments. But the consistency of the basic image is striking. The sun appears pale, shadows weaken, temperatures seem abnormal, the seasons lose confidence. To understand why this matters, it helps to imagine how deeply ancient life is arranged around visible celestial order. Sunrise and sunset divide work, prayer, travel, market activity, and danger. The lengthening and shortening of days marks the year's movement. Heat tells farmers when growth should quicken. Light governs not only the field, but the mind. People know the sky intimately because they live beneath it without the insulation of the modern technology. There is no electric glare to overpower a strange noon, no satellite forecast to explain a haze in the upper atmosphere, no global news system to tell them that distant lands are seeing the same thing. A dim sun is experienced locally, bodily, and spiritually. What they are likely seeing is not smoke in the ordinary sense, not a low cloud sitting over one province, but a high atmospheric veil. Modern science suggests that a major volcanic eruption, perhaps more than one, injected sulfur-rich material into the stratosphere. There, above the weather systems that would normally wash particles away, sulfate aerosols can linger and spread. They scatter incoming sunlight, they reduce the energy reaching the surface, they can cool summers, alter rainfall patterns, and disturb growing seasons across wide regions. Ancient observers do not see the particles. They see the consequence: a sun that seems to have lost its authority. This kind of volcanic dimming is rare in human memory, but not unknowable. Later eruptions offer partial comparisons. The eruption of Tambora in 1815 helped produce the so-called year without a summer in 1816, when frost, crop failures, and strange weather affected parts of Europe and North America. Krakatoa in 1883 coloured sunsets around the world. Modern instruments, shipping records, newspapers, and scientific networks captured those events in ways the 6th century could not. But the comparison helps reveal the mechanism. A volcano does not have to bury a city in ash to change history. If its plume reaches high enough and carries enough sulfur, it can touch places that never hear the eruption. In 536, the veil seems to arrive over societies with no shared explanation. Some may think of divine displeasure, some may suspect omens of war, some may record the event with restrained unease. Others may say nothing in writing because they are too busy surviving the consequences. The silence of many communities should not be mistaken for safety. Writing survives unevenly. A monastery's note may last when a village's fear disappears forever. What survives in the record suggests an atmospheric disturbance large enough to be noticed by literate observers, but the experience itself must have been far broader than the surviving words. There is a lesser-known strangeness in these descriptions. The dimming does not always appear as violent weather. It is not remembered only as storms or floods, though those may have occurred in some regions. It is remembered as a kind of suspended abnormality. The world continues, but under altered light. That is psychologically different from a single disaster. A flood rises and leaves marks. An earthquake breaks walls. A battle fills a field with bodies. A dim year seeps into everything. It changes the colour of days. It makes ordinary routines feel uncertain. It is catastrophe as atmosphere. For farmers, the altered sky would not need to be dramatic to be dangerous. A small reduction in summer warmth can matter if crops are already near the edge of their climatic comfort. A shortened growing season can mean grain that ripens poorly, fruit that fails, hay that comes in thin, animals that enter winter underfed. In northern regions, where agriculture depends on a narrow window of warmth, even a few cold weeks can have consequences. In the Mediterranean, unusual cold or disrupted rainfall can damage carefully balanced systems of cereal farming, olives, vines, and pastoral movement. No single climate signal affects every place in the same way, and scholars still debate the regional pattern of impacts, but the broad danger is clear: the sky's change becomes the field's change. The timing is especially ominous. The dimming begins in a century already full of movement. Armies are campaigning, states are taxing, cities are consuming, trade routes are carrying goods and pathogens alongside rumours and prayers. A pale sun does not announce which granary will fail or which army will starve, but it increases uncertainty everywhere. It makes planning harder. It turns surplus into a question. Ancient governments can store food and move grain, but only if there is enough to move, and only if transport remains secure. When harvests weaken across more than one region, the arithmetic becomes cruel. The human imagination tries to make sense of this. In a world steeped in scripture and classical inheritance, a darkened sun carries echoes of cosmic disorder. It recalls apocalypse, divine anger, the death of rulers, the ending of ages. But the best ancient writers are not always wild or credulous. Some describe what they see with sober precision. They know the sun is supposed to cast shadows. They know seasons are supposed to follow one another. Their alarm comes not from ignorance, but from attention. They're noticing a real break in expectation. At the same time, caution is necessary. Ancient texts can compress time, exaggerate duration, or interpret natural phenomena through moral frameworks. A chronicler might connect events that were separate. A later copyist might preserve a phrase while losing surrounding context. Regional experiences may be generalized into universal claims. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet when written testimony aligns with physical evidence from ice and trees, the story becomes harder to dismiss as literary exaggeration. The dim sun of 536 is not merely a metaphor for troubled times. It appears to have been part of a real climatic shock. The veil also reveals a deep truth about human perception of disaster. People often recognize change before they understand cause. The ancient witnesses see the surface of a planetary process. They see light weakened by material from an eruption that may have occurred far beyond their horizon. They understand the event through religion, omen, and seasonal anxiety. Modern researchers understand it through aerosols, isotopes, and dendrochronology. Both are responding to the same disturbance from different ends of time. One group looks up into a strange sky. The other looks backward into frozen and living archives. And still, the most haunting witness is the ordinary day, not the dramatic night, not the moment of eruption, but the repeated morning when the sun rises and remains wrong. A shepherd notices that warmth is slow to come. A mother measures food more carefully. A trader hears that prices have shifted in another town. A priest watches anxious faces gather beneath a dimmer light. An official wonders whether the next tax demand will be possible. None of them can see the volcanic cloud as a global system, yet all of them live inside it. The veil across the sky marks the turning point because it transforms hidden fragility into visible omen. Before it, the world's stresses are political, military, economic, theological, and local. After it, those stresses exist beneath a shared atmospheric unease. The sun, which should stand above human conflict, seems to have joined the crisis, whether one lives near the imperial court or at the edge of a forest, beside a Mediterranean harbour or in a cold northern valley. The same unsettling question enters daily life if even the light can fail. What else can no longer be trusted? When the light weakens, the first empire to suffer is not Rome or Persia, or any kingdom named in a chronicle. It is the empire of the field. Long before palaces feel the full pressure of disaster, the soil receives it, seeds sit in cold ground, shoots rise slowly. Grain that should thicken under reliable warmth remains thin and uncertain. In orchards, blossoms arrive too early, too late, or not strongly enough. Vines struggle through a season that seems to have misplaced its heat. Pastures offer less than animals need. The crisis begins not as a dramatic collapse of walls, but as a quiet failure of growth. For people in the 6th century, harvest is not an annual convenience. It is the boundary between order and fear. A good harvest means rents can be paid, taxes met, animals fed, seed saved, children carried through winter, and debts postponed for another year. A poor harvest narrows every choice. Families eat seed grain and damage the next season before it begins. Landlords press tenants who have nothing left to give. Local officials face demands from above and desperation from below. Markets become tense places, where the price of bread reveals the mood of an entire society. The evidence remains incomplete, because hunger rarely leaves behind a clean signature. But what survives in climate records and scattered accounts suggests that the dimming of 536 was followed by years in which food security became dangerously fragile. Cold is not always spectacular. It does not need to freeze a river to kill. It can simply shorten the season. A few weeks of reduced warmth can leave grain poorly filled. A late frost can wound crops that looked promising. A wet, cold summer can make hay difficult to dry. And without hay, animals weaken or die in the months when people most need them. In northern Europe, where farming already depends on brief summer abundance, tree rings later show signs of severe stress. In mountain regions, marginal lands become even more marginal. In the Mediterranean, where farmers are skilled at coping with dry summers and uncertain rain, unusual cooling can still disrupt the delicate timing of cereals, olives, vines, and livestock movement. The strange cruelty of this kind of disaster is that it spreads unevenly. One valley may escape the worst, another may lose nearly everything. A coastal city may still receive shipments while its hinterland suffers. A landlord with stored grain may survive comfortably as tenants fall into debt. A monastery with reserves may become a refuge. A poor household has no such insulation. No single explanation fully accounts for all local outcomes. And scholars still debate how sharply different regions felt the cold. But inequality is almost certainly part of the story. Climate shocks do not fall on a flat human surface. They fall on societies already layered by wealth, obligation, power, and vulnerability. In a village, the signs would accumulate before anyone calls it catastrophe. The first worry is the look of the crop. Then comes the counting of stores. Then comes the bargaining. Grain is stretched with whatever can be gathered, ground, boiled, or mixed. Animals that should be kept for milk, wool, ploughing, or breeding may be slaughtered early because there is not enough fodder. Tools are sold, jewellery disappears, debts are renegotiated or enforced. People move toward towns, estates, churches, or roads where they hope food may be found. Some survive by entering deeper dependence on patrons. Some do not survive at all. Ancient famine is not only a shortage of calories, it is a social event. It changes how people see one another. Neighbours become competitors. Officials become threats. Merchants become targets of suspicion. The wealthy become both rescuers and hoarders, depending on who is telling the story. Religious leaders may organize charity, but charity depends on stored abundance. Armies, meanwhile, remain hungry no matter what the sky has done. Soldiers still require grain. Horses still require fodder. Fortresses still require supply. A ruler may want mercy, but a state at war often continues to demand what the countryside can barely provide. This is where the darkened sun begins to move from environment into politics. A harvest failure does not automatically produce rebellion or collapse, but it changes the cost of obedience. Taxation that was resented in ordinary years may become unbearable in lean ones. Military requisition that once seemed harsh may become fatal. Imperial ambition, royal warfare, and local survival collide in barns and granaries. The grand strategies of rulers depend on the small mathematics of rural households. If enough households fail, the map eventually notices. Cities face a different kind of vulnerability. Urban life is built on trust in supply. Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, Rome, and many smaller cities cannot feed themselves from their own streets. They depend on surrounding lands and long-distance movement. Grain must be harvested, collected, stored, shipped, guarded, unloaded, distributed, bought, baked, and consumed. Every link can weaken. A storm at sea matters, a war matters, a bad harvest matters, corruption matters. Panic matters. When people fear scarcity, they change behavior before famine fully arrives. They buy early, hoard secretly, flee, protest, or gather at places of authority. Bread is never just bread in an ancient city. It is proof that the world still has a working order. A lesser-known detail about food crises in antiquity is that they often leave traces in law and administration rather than dramatic stories. Governments issue price controls, restrict movement of grain, punish hoarding, manage distributions, or intervene in local supply. Such measures show that authorities understand hunger as a threat to stability. They also show the limits of command. An emperor can order grain to be moved, but he cannot invent a harvest that failed across too wide an area. He can punish speculation, but fear itself is harder to govern. When the sky has shaken confidence, even accurate information may not calm the crowd. For those living close to subsistence, hunger also weakens the body in ways that prepare later disasters. Malnutrition reduces resistance to disease. It pushes people into movement, crowding, and dependence. It changes burial patterns, household structure, fertility, and childhood survival. It creates silent casualties who never appear in chronicles because they die without political consequence. When plague later enters the 6th century story, it does not enter a perfectly healthy world. Whether climate directly encouraged the spread of disease remains debated, but famine and stress are dangerous companions to any epidemic. The emotional world of crop failure is harder to recover, but it may be the most human part of the catastrophe. A farmer knows the smell of healthy grain. A herder knows the sound of animals that have eaten enough. A mother knows when a child's hunger has become more than ordinary appetite. These are forms of knowledge that do not require writing. They are precise, intimate, and terrifying. When the season fails, people do not experience an abstract climate anomaly. They experience thinner soup, smaller loaves, empty stalls, anxious elders, and the disappearance of choices. And still, life continues. This is important. Catastrophe does not mean that everyone stops working and waits for history to name the event. Fields are replanted, prayers are said, storehouses are guarded, marriages are arranged if they can be. Children chase animals through courtyards. Priests celebrate liturgies beneath altered light. Traders look for profit in scarcity. Officials write demands in the same formal language, even when the countryside beneath that language is fraying. The world becomes harsher, but not silent. In some places, adaptation may have softened the blow. Communities with diverse crops, strong local networks, stored grain, access to fish, wild foods, or trade routes could endure better than those dependent on a narrow agricultural base. Monasteries and estates sometimes functioned as storage centres, employers, and organisers of relief, though they could also accumulate wealth from the desperate. Pastoral groups might shift herds if routes remained open. Coastal populations might lean more heavily on marine resources. The record does not allow one simple picture of universal ruin. What it suggests is a patchwork of suffering, resilience, opportunism, and uneven survival. But patchwork suffering can still change the course of history. The weakened harvests after 536 form the slow underside of the more visible crises to come. They make armies harder to feed, taxes harder to collect, populations easier to unsettle, and diseases more dangerous when they arrive. They deepen existing fractures between ruler and subject, city and countryside, rich and poor, settled farmer and mobile group. The pale sun does not need to kill directly in order to matter. It lowers the margin between ordinary hardship and disaster. The fields that would not grow become the first archive of the darkened year. Long before scientists measure tree rings or ice cores, the land itself keeps the memory in failed grain, thin animals, and human hunger. Most of those traces vanish. The barns collapse. The bodies decay. The spoken fears are lost. But the consequences move forward, carried in weakened households, strained states, abandoned plans, and a growing sense that the world has entered a season no one knows how to end. Centuries later, the darkened year is still there, waiting in places no 6th century witness could have imagined. It waits in ice, it waits in trees, it waits in layers so thin that a human eye would miss them, in chemical traces locked away by snowfall, in rings of wood laid down during summers when growth nearly stopped. The people who lived beneath the pale sun saw fear in the sky, but the sky itself did not keep a written record. Earth did that work quietly, patiently, without knowing that one day researchers would come looking for the missing light. The ice is one of the strangest witnesses. In Greenland and Antarctica, year after year, snow falls and compresses into layered archives of atmosphere. Dust, sea salt, volcanic sulfate, tiny bubbles of ancient air, and chemical signals become trapped inside. A deep ice core is not simply frozen water. It is a vertical library of weather, eruption, pollution, fire, and time. When scientists drill into that library and examine layers from the 6th century, they find evidence of a major volcanic disturbance around 536. Sulfur compounds appear in the ice, suggesting that an eruption sent material high enough into the atmosphere to spread far beyond its source. The ancient chroniclers described a weakened sun. The ice gives that dimness a chemical shadow. But ice alone does not tell the whole story. It can show that volcanic material entered the atmosphere, yet it cannot easily reveal how every village felt the consequences. For that, another archive speaks trees. Each year, a tree adds a ring, in good conditions. The ring may be wide and healthy. In cold, dry or otherwise stressful conditions. The ring may be narrow. Tree ring evidence from parts of the northern hemisphere points to severe growth stress in the mid-6th century, with 536 and the years around it standing out as unusually difficult. Some reconstructions suggest that this period ranks among the coldest intervals of the last 2 millennia. The evidence remains incomplete across regions, but the signal is strong enough to make the old reports of dim sunlight feel less like isolated alarm and more like observation. There is something quietly powerful about this convergence. A chronicler writes that the sun has lost its brightness. A tree, far away, grows a narrow ring. Snow falls over Greenland and seals volcanic chemistry into ice. None of these witnesses knows the others exist. Yet together they form a pattern. That is how much of deep history is rebuilt not from one perfect source, but from different kinds of evidence leaning toward one another across time. Text, ice, wood, sediment, and archaeology do not speak the same language, but when they begin to tell the same story, the past grows sharper. The scientific picture, as it is usually understood, points toward a volcanic climate shock. A major explosive eruption can hurl sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, where it forms sulfate aerosols. These particles reflect and scatter sunlight, reducing the energy that reaches Earth's surface. The effect can last for years, depending on the size, location, chemistry, and timing of the eruption. Tropical eruptions can affect both hemispheres because atmospheric circulation can distribute aerosols widely. High-latitude eruptions may have more uneven but still severe regional effects. Scholars still debate the exact source of the 536 event, and some evidence suggests that more than one eruption may have contributed to the prolonged crisis of the 530s and 540s. This uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of the story. For a long time, the 6th century dimming was known mainly through written accounts, and written accounts can be difficult to interpret. Then physical records made the event harder to ignore, but they also complicated it. Ice cores may show volcanic sulfate, but matching a sulfate spike to a particular volcano is not simple. The eruption may have occurred in a remote region. Its deposits may be buried, eroded, underwater, or not yet confidently identified. Some candidate volcanoes have been proposed, including high-latitude sources, but no single explanation fully accounts for every piece of evidence. The volcano that changed the sky may still be hiding in plain sight, or hiding beneath ice, ash, ocean, or misdated deposits. Tree rings add their own complications. A narrow ring can reflect cold, drought, disease, insect stress, or local conditions. Researchers must compare many trees from many places and build careful chronologies. Even then, climate does not act everywhere the same way. A year that is cold and wet in one region may be dry in another. A tree line in the mountains may register temperature more clearly than a lowland forest. The great challenge is separating local noise from hemispheric signal. Yet around 536 the signal is difficult to explain away. Many records point toward extraordinary stress. One of the more surprising details is how long the disturbance may have echoed. The year 536 is famous because ancient witnesses noticed the dim sun, but climate stress did not necessarily end neatly when the calendar changed. Evidence points to additional volcanic activity in the following years, especially around 540. This means that the ancient world may not have faced a single blow, but a cluster of blows dimming, cooling, poor harvests. Then renewed atmospheric disruption before recovery was secure. For farmers and states, this distinction matters. One bad year can be survived with reserves. Several bad years can consume reserves, seed grain, livestock, political patience, and human strength. This helps explain why the 6th century can feel like a hinge in history. The climate shock does not need to be imagined as a lone assassin of empires. It is more like a heavy weight placed on systems already under strain. Physical evidence reveals the weight. Historical evidence reveals the systems. The ice tells us something entered the atmosphere. The trees tell us growth suffered. Chronicles tell us people noticed the sky and feared what followed. Archaeology can sometimes show settlement disruption, changing burial practices, altered trade, or shifts in land use, though these traces must be interpreted carefully. The best picture is cumulative, not simple. Modern science also forces a humbling change in perspective. Ancient people often explained strange skies through divine warning or cosmic disorder. Modern researchers explain them through aerosols and radiative forcing, yet both are trying to grasp scale. A volcanic eruption is a local event at the moment of explosion, but if powerful enough, it becomes planetary. Ash may fall near the mountain, but sulfur travels invisibly. A farmer thousands of kilometers away may never see ash, never hear the eruption, never know the name of the mountain, and still lose a harvest because of it. This is one of the most unsettling facts of the 536 event. The cause and consequence are separated by distances so vast that human imagination struggles to connect them. The ice cores make that connection visible. In a narrow band of frozen chemistry, a distant eruption crosses into human history. The sulfate layer is not dramatic to look at. It does not resemble a ruined city or a battlefield. It is a faint trace in a cylinder of ice. Yet it represents a sky altered enough for chroniclers to notice and trees to struggle. It is a reminder that the most important evidence is not always monumental. Sometimes history survives as a measurement. Still, caution remains essential. The temptation is to turn the scientific evidence into a clean story. Volcano erupts, sun dims, crops fail, empires collapse. Reality resists that neatness. Climate shocks interact with politics, disease, trade, social inequality, and chance. Some places suffer intensely, others adapt. Some records are loud, others are silent. Some societies transform for reasons that began long before 536. Scholars still debate the exact magnitude of cooling, the eruption source, the regional impacts, and the connection between climate and later events such as plague. The evidence is powerful, but it does not remove complexity. What it does remove is the idea that the darkened sun was only legend. The pale light described in 6th century texts has a physical counterpart. The field failures have a biological counterpart. The fear has a climatic counterpart. Ice, trees, and ancient clues draw the story out of rumour and into Earth's memory. They show that something vast happened, something capable of reaching across continents and entering the lives of people who had no way to understand its origin. And perhaps that is why these archives feel so haunting. The ancient witnesses looked upward and saw a weakened sun. The trees simply stopped growing well. The ice received the fallout in silence. For more than 1,000 years, the clues waited apart from one another, each preserving a fragment of the same broken season. Only when they're read together does the old darkness return with clarity, not as myth, not as exaggeration, but as one of the rare moments when the machinery of the planet becomes visible through the suffering of human history. Somewhere, a mountain opened. That is the simplest way to say it, though the truth may be less simple and far more elusive. The sky that dimmed in 536 almost certainly darkened because volcanic material reached the high atmosphere. but the volcano itself remains one of the great missing characters in the story. It left fingerprints in ice, shadows in tree rings, and fear in human records. Yet the place of the eruption is still debated. The ancient world felt the blow, but it did not name the weapon. This absence is strange because volcanic eruptions can be spectacularly visible near their source. They can bury settlements, darken local skies with ash, poison water, flatten forests, trigger lahars, and leave thick geological deposits that seem impossible to overlook. But the most historically disruptive eruptions are not always the ones best remembered by witnesses. A volcano may erupt in a remote region, far from literate societies. It may explode in a landscape where oral memory later breaks, or where no written tradition survives. It may leave deposits that are difficult to date precisely. It may erupt beneath ice, beside the sea, or in a place where later erosion, vegetation, or human disturbance hides the scars. The world can be changed by a disaster almost nobody nearby writes down. The leading explanation for the dimming remains volcanic because the physical evidence points strongly in that direction. Sulfate layers in polar ice suggest that sulfur-rich material entered the stratosphere, where it could spread and reduce sunlight. Tree ring data suggest cooling severe enough to damage growth across broad areas. Written accounts describe a dimmed sun and abnormal seasons. Together, these clues form a pattern that fits explosive volcanism better than most alternatives. But fitting the pattern is not the same as identifying the culprit. Scholars still debate whether the 536 event came from one enormous eruption, a high-latitude eruption with strong regional effects, a tropical eruption that spread aerosols more widely, or a sequence of eruptions that compounded one another. One reason the problem is difficult is that ice cores record arrival, not origin. Sulfate in Greenland or Antarctica tells researchers that volcanic material reached the polar regions, but it does not automatically reveal where the volcano stood. Chemical signatures can sometimes help. Tiny shards of volcanic glass, known as tephra, may be trapped in the ice, and their composition can be compared to known volcanic deposits. When a match is strong, the ice can point back to a source. But such matches are delicate. The particles may be extremely small. Contamination must be avoided. Dating must be precise. A similar chemical profile can lead to debate, and sometimes the perfect matching deposit has not yet been found. Several candidates have been discussed over the years, including volcanoes in high northern latitudes and possibly tropical regions. Some studies have looked toward Icelandic sources, partly because material found in ice and the pattern of northern hemisphere cooling may fit eruptions from that volcanic region. Others have considered the possibility of eruptions elsewhere, including North America, Central America, or other volcanic belts capable of sending sulfur high into the atmosphere. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for every clue. The mystery is not that scientists lack a mechanism. The mystery is that the mechanism has not yet been tied to one uncontested mountain. This matters because the location of the eruption would shape the climate impact. A tropical eruption can inject aerosols into atmospheric circulation systems that spread material into both hemispheres, potentially producing widespread cooling. A high-latitude eruption may have a stronger effect in the hemisphere where it occurs, especially if it happens during a season favourable for aerosol persistence and distribution. The amount of sulfur matters. The height of the plume matters. The timing within the year matters. Even the size of ash deposits near the volcano is not always a perfect guide to climate impact, because ash falls quickly, while sulfur can travel invisibly and linger. A volcano that does not leave the most dramatic local ash blanket may still dim distant skies if its sulfur reaches the stratosphere. This is one of the lesser-known lessons of volcanic history. The deadliest reach of an eruption may be almost invisible. Pompeii was destroyed by ash and pyroclastic flows, a local catastrophe preserved in terrible detail. Tambora changed weather and harvests across distant continents, not because ash buried Europe or North America, but because atmospheric chemistry shifted. The 6th century eruption belongs to this second category. Its most important effects may have unfolded far from the blast, in places where no one saw fire, only a sickened sun. There is also the possibility that 536 was not the only blow. Evidence for another major volcanic event around 540 suggests that the late 530s and early 540s may have brought repeated atmospheric shocks. If so, the ancient world suffered not a single dark year, but a staggered sequence of disruptions. The first dimming weakened harvests and confidence. A later eruption may have renewed cooling before recovery was complete. This is a harsher scenario because societies can often survive one failed season by consuming reserves, importing food, slaughtering animals, borrowing, or relying on patrons. But repeated shocks eat through the buffers. They turn emergency measures into permanent weakness. Imagine a household after the first bad harvest. The family has less grain, but perhaps enough to endure. They sell an animal, reduce meals, borrow from a landowner, postpone repairs, pray for better weather. Then another poor season follows. The seed grain is smaller. The animal is gone. Debt has grown. Children are weaker. If a third shock arrives, the crisis is no longer only environmental, it becomes structural. The household's future has been consumed. The same logic applies upward to estates, towns, armies, and empires. Repeated stress changes what survival costs. The unknown volcano therefore becomes more than a geological puzzle. It becomes a symbol of hidden causation in history. Human beings often explain collapse through visible actors: kings, generals, invasions, rebellions, corrupt courts, ambitious ministers, bad laws. These are real, but behind them may stand forces that never appear in royal inscriptions. A cloud of sulfate can alter the outcome of a campaign by thinning the harvest that feeds the army. A cold summer can reduce tax revenue. A famine can push migration. Hunger can deepen resentment against rulers already seen as distant or unjust. The volcano does not command armies, but it changes the world in which armies move. At the same time, it would be misleading to imagine the eruption as a single master key. The ancient world was not a row of dominoes waiting for one volcanic push. Some regions had strong institutions, local reserves, flexible economies, or ecological diversity. Others were more exposed. The impact of the eruption depended on where people lived, what they grew, how much they stored, who ruled them, how trade connected them, and whether war or disease arrived at the same time. The volcano nobody saw did not write the whole history of the 6th century. It added a severe and poorly understood pressure at exactly the wrong moment. The lack of an eyewitness account from the eruption zone also changes the emotional texture of the story. There is no preserved village scene, no named survivor describing ashfall, no ancient scientist measuring the plume. Instead, the event is reconstructed backward from consequences. It is like hearing a scream echo through many valleys and never finding the cliff where the fall began. Ice cores become detectives, tree rings become witnesses, chronicles become fragments of testimony. The volcano itself remains silent. Modern researchers continue to refine the picture: improved ice core dating, chemical analysis of microscopic tephra, climate modelling, and comparisons with known eruptions all help narrow the possibilities. Each method has strengths and uncertainties. Models can estimate how aerosols might spread, but they depend on assumptions about eruption size and location. Tephra can identify sources, but only if samples and reference deposits align. Historical records can describe effects, but they are uneven and culturally interpreted. The result is a mystery with a strong outline and a missing centre. Perhaps that missing centre is part of why the year 536 holds such fascination. It is not simply a disaster. It is a disaster with an unseen origin. The people of the time looked at a wounded sun and did not know where the wound had been made. We know far more, but not everything. The ancient fear has been translated into scientific language, yet the mountain behind it remains uncertain. Somewhere in the geological record, perhaps under ice, forest, sea, or misread ash, lies the moment when Earth opened and history shifted. And as the veil spread from that unknown eruption, it crossed borders that mattered deeply to humans and meant nothing to the atmosphere. It passed over rival empires, over disputed frontiers, over villages that had never heard of Constantinople, over fields taxed by kings whose names would vanish, over forests where no one wrote chronicles at all. The cloud did not know Rome from Persia, rich from poor, Christian from pagan, soldier from child. It simply changed the light. Beneath that changed light, a world already cracking began to hear the sound of its own fractures. The darkened sky did not fall on a peaceful world. It fell on a world already cracking in ways that no one living inside it could fully see. Empires rarely feel fragile at the centre. In the halls of government, there are seals, ledgers, orders, guards, ceremonies, polished floors, and men who speak as though command itself is a form of stability. Maps make territory look solid. Coins make authority look permanent. Laws make society look legible. But beyond the capital, beyond the roads regularly patrolled, beyond the offices where taxes are counted, life is held together by bargains that can break under pressure. By the time the sun weakens, many of those bargains are already strained. War is one of the deepest fractures. Justinian's attempt to restore Roman power across the Mediterranean is bold, even brilliant in its early successes, but it also stretches the empire across distance, debt, and resistance. North Africa is reclaimed from the Vandals, yet victory does not end the need for soldiers. Italy becomes a far harsher struggle. The Gothic War will drag on through sieges, devastation, shifting loyalties, and ruined cities. A campaign that begins as restoration gradually becomes a grinding contest over a land already weary from centuries of political change. Armies consume what they pass through. Even disciplined armies require food, animals, labour, and money. A countryside under military pressure is less able to absorb bad weather, failed harvests, or sudden disease. To the east, the rivalry with Persia never fully disappears. Rome and the Sasanian Empire are two great machines facing one another across a frontier of fortresses, client kingdoms, desert routes, and mountain passes. Peace can be negotiated, but suspicion remains. Tribute may buy time, not trust. Campaigns flare. Border cities become prizes and wounds. Both empires are sophisticated, organized, and proud. Yet both are expensive to maintain. Their rivalry is not a side note to the climate crisis. It is part of the burden that makes climate crisis more dangerous. A state preparing for war cannot easily tell its armies to wait because the grain has failed. Taxation adds another pressure. Ancient states do not function without extraction. Roads, walls, courts, officials, fleets, armies, and imperial projects all require resources, and those resources ultimately come from land, labour, trade, and households. In prosperous years, taxation may be resented but survivable. In hard years, it becomes a blade. A farmer with a weak harvest still faces obligations. A village that cannot meet its quota may be punished, indebted, or forced into dependence on powerful landholders. Officials are often squeezed from above and hated from below. The law may acknowledge hardship in theory, but bureaucratic systems are not always merciful in practice. The evidence remains incomplete, especially for the poorest communities. Yet the broad pattern is familiar when harvests fail. Fixed demands become dangerous. Social inequality makes the damage uneven. Large landowners often possess reserves, connections, legal influence, and the ability to shift loss onto tenants or labourers. Poor farmers possess fewer buffers. Urban elites can sometimes buy their way through scarcity. The poor wait in lines, riot, migrate, or starve. Monasteries and churches may distribute charity, but they also hold property and become part of local power structures. Soldiers may protect communities, or they may requisition from them. Merchants may keep supply lines alive, or they may profit from panic. No single explanation fully accounts for every region, because local conditions matter enormously. But the climate shock enters a world where suffering is already organized by hierarchy. Migration and movement add further instability. Late antiquity is not a static age of people fixed forever to ancestral soil. Groups move because of war, opportunity, pressure, diplomacy, enslavement, trade, and survival. Some movements are large and politically visible, others are quiet and local. People leave farms ruined by conflict. Soldiers settle far from home. Captives are moved across borders. Merchants connect distant ports. Refugees gather near cities, fortresses, estates, and churches. Movement can strengthen societies by spreading skills and creating new networks. But under stress, it also carries fear, disease, rumour, and competition for food. When the climate turns against harvests, movement becomes not only a choice but a symptom. Trade, which once looks like resilience, can become vulnerability. The Mediterranean remains a world of ships and ports, grain, oil, wine, ceramics, textiles, metalwork, and luxury goods still travel across water and land. These networks allow cities to survive beyond local resources. They also bind distant regions into shared risk. A port dependent on imported grain is exposed to storms, piracy, war, administrative failure, and harvest trouble elsewhere. A disruption in one region can echo in another through prices, shortages, and delayed shipments. Connectivity does not prevent crisis, it changes its shape. Disease is already part of the background before the Great Plague erupts into the narrative. Ancient cities are crowded, often unsanitary by modern standards, and closely linked to trade routes. Humans live near animals, waste, insects, stored grain, and water systems that can sustain pathogens. People do not understand microbes, but they understand contagion. In practical ways, some sicknesses move through households, streets, armies, and ships. Famine and cold can weaken bodies. War concentrates people in camps and besieged cities. Trade moves rats, fleas, grain, cloth, and human travellers. Scholars still debate the precise relationship between climate stress and the later Justinianic plague. But it is clear that the 6th century world offers many pathways for disease to travel once conditions allow. Religious conflict also matters. The Roman Empire is officially Christian, but Christianity in this period is not a single calm voice. Doctrinal disputes divide bishops, monks, emperors, cities, and provinces. These debates are about theology, but they are also about identity, authority, language, region, and resistance to imperial control. In Egypt, Syria, Palestine, Constantinople, and beyond, religious disagreement can shape loyalty to the state. When disaster arrives, people interpret it through these tensions. A famine can become evidence of divine displeasure, a plague can become judgment, an emperor's policy can be blamed not only for political failure but for cosmic disorder. The sky darkens, and every faction may believe it knows why. A lesser-known fracture lies in the burden of imperial magnificence itself. Justinian's age produces extraordinary achievements: legal codification, monumental architecture, military recovery, theological intervention, administrative ambition. These are not illusions. They are real expressions of power. But magnificence has a cost. The construction of great buildings, the maintenance of court ceremony, the funding of campaigns, and the administration of distant territories all require a flow of resources from people whose lives may be far less magnificent. Hagia Sophia rises in breathtaking splendor, but somewhere grain must be collected, stone quarried, timber moved, workers paid or compelled, and taxes enforced. Civilizations often display their confidence most brilliantly just before their limits become visible. This is not to say that the world is doomed before 536. That would be too simple. Many societies in late antiquity are adaptive and resilient. Local communities know how to endure bad years. Empires can redistribute food, negotiate peace, shift armies, reform taxation, and rely on religious institutions for support. Trade routes can reroute. Farmers can replant. Elites can bargain. People can survive astonishing hardship. What makes the darkened sun so consequential is that it arrives when multiple systems must all work well at once. A resilient world can manage a local harvest failure. It can manage a war. It can manage political tension. It may struggle when climate shock, war, hunger, debt, disease, and fear begin to overlap. In that overlap, small failures magnify. A delayed grain shipment becomes an urban crisis. A cold season becomes a fiscal shortfall. A hungry population becomes more vulnerable to epidemic. An army short of supplies becomes more brutal towards civilians. A ruler trying to project strength becomes more dependent on harsh extraction. Local resentment becomes political opportunity for rivals. The atmosphere does not create every fracture, but it presses on all of them. Like water entering cracks in stone, cold and hunger widen weaknesses that already exist. The most dangerous cracks are often invisible from the capital. Constantinople can still appear magnificent. Court rituals continue, laws are issued, diplomats arrive, ships enter the harbour, the emperor still commands. But in villages far away, the meaning of empire may be reduced to tax collectors, soldiers, religious demands, and uncertain protection. If the harvest fails and relief does not come, loyalty becomes thinner. If plague follows hunger, grief becomes impossible to govern. If war destroys fields, the promise of the Roman order begins to sound distant. The empire remains powerful, but power is not the same as trust. Beyond Rome, the same principle applies. The Gothic kingdom in Italy, the Frankish realms in Gaul, the Visigothic kingdom in Spain, the Sasanian Empire in the east, and smaller communities across Europe and Asia all depend on balances that are partly environmental and partly human. Kings need warriors, warriors need reward, land needs labour, labour needs food, faith needs explanation, trade needs confidence. When the sky changes, it touches each balance in a different way. Some rulers exploit the crisis. Some are overwhelmed by it. Some regions fade from written record just when their suffering may be most intense. A world already cracking does not necessarily collapse in one dramatic sound. It changes tone. People become cautious. Reserves shrink. Violence becomes easier to justify. Local power grows where central power cannot help. Religious explanations sharpen. Migrants move. Soldiers take more. Officials demand what cannot be given. The old future becomes less believable, not all at once, but season by season. What survives in the records suggests that the mid-6th century was not simply an age struck by disaster from outside. It was an age in which disaster found structures prepared to transmit its force. So the pale sun becomes more than an omen. It becomes a revealer. It shows that the confidence of empires rests on harvests, that law rests on bodies strong enough to obey it, that armies rest on fields, that faith is tested by hunger, and that the distance between order and fear is often shorter than rulers imagine. The world has not yet reached its deepest crisis. The plague has not yet fully entered. The wars have not yet consumed all they will consume. But the cracks are open now, and under the strange light of 536 they are beginning to widen. Constantinople does not look like a city waiting for catastrophe. It rises from the edge of Europe into the meeting place of seas, guarded by walls so immense they seem less built than declared. Ships crowd its harbours, markets pull in goods from Egypt, Syria, the Black Sea, North Africa, and lands still farther away. Marble columns, churches, palaces, warehouses, workshops, and crowded streets turn the city into the visible heart of an empire that refuses to think of itself as diminished. Even under a weakened sun, Constantinople carries the habit of command. It has survived riots, sieges, fires, theological storms, and political danger. It knows how to endure, but endurance is not immunity. Justinian's reign is one of those moments in history when ambition becomes almost architectural. It is not enough for him to rule what remains secure. He seeks to restore, define, and sanctify the Roman world. Law is gathered and reshaped into a monumental code. Churches rise with the beauty meant to make imperial faith visible in stone and gold. Armies cross the sea to reclaim provinces that had slipped from Roman rule. North Africa falls back into imperial hands with astonishing speed. And for a moment the Mediterranean seems to remember its old unity. The emperor's dream is not small. He does not want survival alone. He wants restoration. Yet the same ambition that makes the reign magnificent also makes it exposed. When the sun dims in 536, Justinian's empire is already committed to vast undertakings. War in Italy is beginning to turn from a swift campaign into a long wound. North Africa, recently recovered, must be defended and administered. The Persian frontier remains dangerous. Troops need pay, fleets need maintenance, officials need authority, and cities need food. The machinery of empire is moving in several directions at once. A climate shock does not stop that machinery immediately. It makes every movement more costly. In Constantinople, food is the foundation of public order. A capital of such scale cannot live from its own gardens and nearby fields. It depends on organized supply, especially grain shipped across long distances. The city's greatness is therefore inseparable from the sea and from the agricultural regions that feed it. When harvests falter, the problem is not merely rural, it travels toward the capital in the form of prices, shortages, rationing, anxiety, and rumour. A hungry countryside may suffer quietly, but a hungry city becomes political. Crowds can gather, anger can find a voice. The ruler who appears mighty in ceremony may suddenly be judged by the weight of bread. Justinian understands danger from crowds. Only a few years before the dimming, in 532 the Nika riots nearly destroyed his rule. Constantinople erupted into violence after tensions involving chariot factions, taxation, justice, and resentment against officials boiled over. Much of the city burned. For a terrifying moment, the emperor considered flight. The revolt was crushed with brutal force, and imperial authority survived, but the memory would have remained close. The capital was not a passive stage for power, it was a living, volatile organism. Under ordinary sunlight, it could nearly overthrow an emperor. Under darkened skies and rising scarcity, its mood mattered even more. The empire's ability to respond to crisis is impressive, but it is also bureaucratic, and bureaucracy moves through people. Officials must collect information, enforce orders, move goods, punish evasion, negotiate with local elites, and make distant realities fit imperial demands. In a year of uncertain harvests, every report becomes suspect. One province may claim distress to reduce its tax burden, another may hide reserves, merchants may delay sales. Local magnates may protect their own stores first. The emperor's command radiates outward, but it returns through channels full of self-interest, fear, and delay. The evidence remains incomplete, but the logic of such systems is clear when scarcity grows. Administration becomes both more necessary and less trusted. The Italian War shows this problem in brutal form. Italy is not an empty prize waiting to be reclaimed. It is a land of cities, estates, memories, loyalties, and armies. The struggle between imperial forces and the Ostrogoths stretches across years of siege and devastation. Rome itself changes hands. Countryside is stripped. Supply lines become lifelines. War turns agricultural landscapes into military resources, and military resources into ruins. When climate stress weakens production, war magnifies the damage. A field that might have yielded less because of cold may yield nothing if soldiers trample it, seize animals, or drive labourers away. The restoration of empire begins to look, for many caught beneath it, like another form of destruction. Justinian's government is not blind to suffering, but it is trapped by scale. To retreat would be to abandon the imperial vision. To continue requires extracting more from a world that may be producing less. This is the cruel arithmetic of late antique ambition. The emperor can see the map, the peasant can see the granary. Both are real. Both define the empire. But when the granary empties, the map becomes harder to defend. There is a lesser-known irony in Justinian's reign. It is remembered both for order and for upheaval. His legal reforms aim to create clarity, permanence, and imperial coherence. His buildings aim to embody sacred stability. His campaigns aim to restore lost unity. Yet his era becomes associated with darkness, famine, plague, and war. This does not mean his achievements were false. It means that history can preserve human intention and environmental disruption in the same frame. A law code can outlast the society that first needed it. A cathedral can shine while the countryside that funded it suffers. a ruler can be both visionary and overextended. Under the dimmed sun, Constantinople's symbolic role deepens. If the sun itself seems weakened, the emperor's image as guardian of an order is placed under pressure. In Christian imperial thought, the ruler is not merely a political manager. He is expected to defend true faith, justice, peace, and the moral health of the realm. Disasters therefore invite interpretation. Famine, strange weather, earthquakes, and disease are not just events. They are messages to be argued over. Supporters may call for repentance and unity. Critics may see divine anger against policy, doctrine, luxury, taxation, or war. Scholars still debate how ordinary people connected these events in daily thought, but the written culture of the age makes one thing clear: catastrophe demanded meaning. Then there is the physical city itself. Constantinople is crowded, wealthy, and dependent. Its strength lies in concentration, but concentration is dangerous when food is uncertain and disease approaches. Grain stores, markets, docks, and dense neighborhoods create a landscape of survival and vulnerability. Rats and fleas, though not understood as agents of plague by the people of the time, thrive around stored grain and human settlement. Ships bring goods, but also living passengers no official intends to welcome. The same networks that make the capital magnificent make it permeable. The city is a jewel, but also a funnel. For a while, imperial confidence continues. The pale sun does not instantly halt campaigns or empty the palace. Officials still write, soldiers still march, builders still build, priests still chant beneath domes. The empire is too large and too deeply organized to collapse at the first sign of abnormal weather. This is important, because the story of 536 is not a simple tale of immediate ruin. It is a story of compounding stress. The sky darkens, harvests weaken, wars continue, and the empire keeps demanding motion. That persistence is both its strength and its danger. In North Africa, the recent Roman victory creates new obligations. The province is valuable, fertile, and strategically important, but conquest does not erase instability. Local resistance, military unrest, administrative adjustment, and the need to secure grain supplies all require attention. In the east, Persia remains a rival too powerful to ignore. In the Balkans, pressure from groups beyond the frontier continues to trouble imperial defences. The empire is not facing one crisis. It is facing many, and the climate shock thickens the air around all of them. What survives in the record suggests that Justinian's world did not understand the dimming as a technical climate event, but it did understand disorder, the sky, the fields, the wars, the rumours, the tremors of disease, and the demands of government all belong to a single moral and political atmosphere. Modern analysis separates them into categories: volcanology, agrarian economy, epidemiology, military history, theology. People living through them did not experience them separately. They experienced a world becoming harder to trust. Byzantium under a darkened sun is therefore not an image of instant collapse, but of a great system trying to continue beneath altered conditions. Its walls still stand, its emperor still rules, its armies still carry Roman banners into contested lands. Its churches still proclaim cosmic order. Yet beneath the ceremonies, the empire is entering a period in which every weakness will cost more than before. The dim sun has not destroyed Justinian's dream. It has made the dream heavier, and soon. From ports, ships, grain stores, and bodies moving along the arteries of empire, Another force will enter the story, one that turns hunger and fear into something far more intimate, the terror of breath, fever, swelling, and sudden death. The plague does not announce itself as history at first. It arrives as sickness in bodies, as fever in one household, swelling in another, a sudden death that seems terrible but not yet world-changing. Then the pattern becomes harder to ignore. More people fall ill. Fear begins to travel faster than certainty. Streets that should be full of bargaining, labour, and argument take on a different sound. Doors close. Families count the living. Priests are summoned until there are too many dying for the old rhythms of care. Officials try to preserve order while order itself becomes a question of burial, bread, and breath. The Justinianic plague is one of the most infamous disasters of the 6th century, and it enters the story not long after the darkened sun and the years of climatic stress. The first major pandemic wave reaches the Eastern Roman world in the early 540 s, with Constantinople struck terribly in 542. Ancient writers describe mortality on a scale so vast that modern scholars treat their numbers with caution. Yet even cautious readings leave no doubt that the trauma was severe. The disease is generally identified with plague caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium associated with later plague pandemics, though the exact scale, regional impact, and long-term demographic consequences remain debated. For people at the time, plague is not bacteriology. It is invasion without an army. It enters through the familiar channels of civilization ships, roads, markets, ports, grain supply, military movement. The empire's connectivity, so essential to its power, becomes a pathway for death. Grain ships that feed cities may also carry rats. Stored grain sustains humans and rodents together. Fleas move between hosts. Travellers carry sickness before anyone understands what they carry. No one sees a microbe. They see the body betray itself. The connection between the climate crisis and the plague is one of the most difficult and important questions in this whole story. It is tempting to draw a straight line. Volcano darkens the sun. Cold causes famine. Famine weakens people. Plague spreads. Empire collapses. But history rarely obeys straight lines. Scholars still debate how directly the volcanic events of 536 and around 540 contributed to the emergence and spread of the Justinianic plague. Climate shifts may have affected rodent populations in parts of Asia, or changed ecological conditions in ways that helped plague move. Hunger and social stress may have made human populations more vulnerable. Trade and war certainly helped connect distant regions. Yet no single explanation fully accounts for the pandemic. What can be said is more careful and perhaps more unsettling. The plague did not need the darkened sun in order to exist, but the darkened sun may have helped create a world less prepared to withstand it. Years of poor harvests weaken bodies and institutions. War pushes people into movement. Crowded cities depend on grain systems that link humans, rodents, and ships. Taxation and military campaigns keep goods and people moving, even when caution might have slowed them. In this sense, climate is not the sole cause. It is part of the stage on which disease becomes catastrophe. Constantinople becomes the terrifying centre of that stage. The city's size, wealth, and connections make it vulnerable in precisely the ways that make it imperial. Ships arrive, warehouses fill, markets circulate food, dense neighbourhoods hold thousands of people in close proximity. When plague takes hold, the capital's normal strengths become liabilities. The same concentration that allows administration, worship, commerce, and power also allows fear to multiply. Burial becomes an administrative crisis. Labor vanishes. Families collapse. The emperor himself is reported to have fallen ill and survived, a detail that would have carried enormous symbolic weight. If even the ruler's body can be invaded, the empire's sacred image of order trembles. Ancient descriptions of the plague are difficult to read because they combine observation, horror, theology, and literary inheritance. Writers may emphasize divine judgment, moral disorder, or the unprecedented nature of suffering. Some details are medically recognizable: fever, buboes, delirium, sudden death. Others are shaped by the conventions of catastrophe writing. The evidence remains incomplete, and modern historians continue to argue over how far the disease spread, how many died, and how deeply it altered the economy. But there is no serious doubt that the pandemic struck hard and returned in waves. A single outbreak is terrible. Recurring plague is civilization under siege by time. The recurrence matters. Societies can mourn one disaster and rebuild. Repeated waves change expectation. They empty households again after recovery begins. They disrupt inheritance, labor, military recruitment, tax collection, religious life, and memory. Children grow up in the shadow of returning sickness. Communities learn that survival once does not guarantee survival next time. The plague becomes not an event but a condition, appearing and fading, then appearing again. It teaches people to expect interruption. There is a lesser-known consequence of plague that is easy to miss. It changes the value of labor. If population falls significantly in a region, workers may become scarcer, wages may shift, estates may struggle to maintain production, and land may be reorganized. But the effects are not uniform. Powerful landowners and states may try to hold labor in place through law and coercion. Some communities may gain bargaining power, others may be crushed by debt, obligation, or violence. The pandemic does not simply reduce numbers, it rearranges relationships between land, work, and authority. What survives in the record suggests both suffering and adaptation, though the balance differed from place to place. For Justinian's empire, plague arrives at a terrible time. The Italian war is still consuming resources. The Persian frontier remains dangerous. Recently reconquered territories require garrisons and administration. The tax system depends on people being alive, productive, and traceable. Armies depend on recruits and supply. Cities depend on merchants, dock workers, bakers, carters, scribes, sailors, and farmers beyond the walls. Plague cuts through those dependencies. It does not respect office. It does not pause for campaigns. It does not care that the emperor is trying to rebuild Rome. And yet the empire does not simply disappear. This is important. The Eastern Roman state survives the plague. It continues to wage war, collect taxes, negotiate, build, and govern. Its endurance is remarkable. But survival can conceal damage. A wounded empire may keep speaking in the language of strength because that is what empires do. The deeper question is not whether the plague instantly destroyed Byzantium. It did not. The deeper question is what possibilities it closed. What campaigns became harder? What reforms became impossible? What villages never recovered? What families ended? What local loyalties shifted because imperial help did not arrive? These questions are harder to answer, but they matter. The plague also transforms the meaning of the earlier darkened sky. A strange sun alone might have been remembered as an omen. Famine alone might have been remembered as hardship. War alone might have been remembered as imperial ambition. But when plague follows, the events begin to cluster in human memory. The world appears not merely troubled but judged, as if one sign has led to another. Modern analysis separates atmospheric aerosols from bacterial infection, but people living through the sequence experience a chain of dread. First the light fails, then the harvest strains, then the bodies fall. Even if the causal links are complex, the emotional links are immediate. There is also a geographic humility in this story. The plague that strikes Constantinople likely has roots far beyond the capital. It moves through ecological zones, trade routes, animal hosts, and human systems larger than any single empire. Rome may imagine itself the centre of the world, but disease reveals another map, one drawn by rodents, fleas, grain, climate, roads, ports, and chance. The empire is powerful, but it is not sealed. No wall, not even the great Theodosian walls, can keep out what arrives hidden in the ordinary movement of life. For ordinary people, plague collapses the distance between world history and the body. Climate shock may be felt in hunger and cold, but plague is intimate. It enters the skin, the lymph, the breath, the bed. It turns relatives into risks and caregivers into the brave or the doomed. It forces choices that no chronicle can fully preserve, whether to flee, whether to stay, whether to touch the sick, whether to bury the dead, whether to spend the last stored grain on medicine, prayer, travel, or food. The empire's grand narrative narrows to a room where someone is not recovering. Still, even here, life does not become only death. People care for one another. Institutions adapt. Survivors inherit property, skills, trauma, and responsibility. Religious communities interpret and respond. Governments attempt measures. However limited by ancient understanding, trade resumes because it must. Fields are worked because hunger does not wait for grief to end. Human beings are not passive before catastrophe. They are frightened, damaged, often overwhelmed, but they continue. The plague enters the story as a second darkness, not in the sky, but in the bloodstream. It turns the atmospheric mystery of 536 into part of a wider age of disruption. Whether climate helped unleash it, magnify it, or merely accompanied it, remains debated, and the evidence does not allow a simple verdict. But the sequence is enough to make the 6th century feel almost unreal in its cruelty: a weakened sun, failing harvests, imperial wars, and then a pandemic moving through the arteries of the connected world. The old order does not fall in one clean motion. It sickens, fights, adapts, and survives unevenly. And beyond Constantinople, across the cold fields and fragmented kingdoms of Europe, the same strange century leaves quieter marks, harder to read, but no less important. Across Europe, the darkened sun leaves fewer grand witnesses than it does in Constantinople. There is no single imperial capital to gather the fear into one dramatic account. No vast bureaucracy preserving the anxieties of a continent in orderly files. Much of Europe in the 6th century speaks to us through fragments: a chronicle entry, a narrow tree ring, an abandoned farmstead, a disturbed burial ground, a shift in settlement, a rumour preserved by a later writer, a silence where one expects continuity. The suffering is not always loud in the record, but silence should not be mistaken for peace. Cold hunger often moves through history without leaving its name. In northern and western Europe, the climate shock may have been especially harsh because agriculture there depends so intensely on the brief generosity of summer. A field that loses warmth in Italy suffers. A field that loses warmth near the edge of viable grain production may fail entirely. Tree rings from parts of Europe and nearby regions suggest that growth slowed sharply during the mid-6th century, a biological memory of summers that did not fully arrive. The people living there did not need instruments to know this. They saw it in grain heads that stayed thin, in hay that came late or badly, in animals that entered winter underfed, in barns that failed to fill, in the faces of children who learned too early that hunger could last longer than a season. Europe at this time is politically fragmented, but not empty, not primitive, and not without memory. The Western Roman Empire has ceased to exist as a central political structure, yet Roman roads, cities, villas, laws, bishops, coins, habits of administration, and Latin literacy continue in altered forms. Frankish kings compete and expand in Gaul. Ostrogothic Italy is being torn apart by war with Justinian's armies. Visigothic Spain holds together a kingdom shaped by Roman inheritance and internal tension. In Britain, post-Roman societies are transforming in ways still difficult to reconstruct. Across Scandinavia and the Baltic worlds, communities leave traces in burials, halls, hoards, and later legend rather than continuous written history. The continent is not one story. It is many small worlds under the same uncertain light. One of the most haunting regions in this wider story is Scandinavia. Archaeological and environmental evidence has suggested that the mid-6th century brought severe disruption in parts of the north. In some areas, farms appear to have been abandoned, settlements reorganized, and social patterns altered. Scholars still debate the exact relationship between these changes and the volcanic climate shock, because archaeology rarely offers a single cause neatly attached to one year. War, internal competition, disease, changing trade, and longer-term social transformation may all have played roles, but the timing is difficult to ignore. In lands where winter already dominates the imagination, a series of failed or shortened summers could become a cultural wound. Later Norse mythology preserves the terrifying idea of Fimbulwinter, a great winter before the end of the world, a season of deep cold and social breakdown. It would be careless to claim that this myth is simply a direct memory of 536. Myths are layered, reshaped, and carried through centuries of storytelling. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet it is also not unreasonable to wonder whether memories of extraordinary cold, dimness, and hunger helped feed later images of cosmic winter. Human cultures often preserve disaster not as a dated report, but as atmosphere, symbol, and warning. A failed sun can become theology. A cold decade can become myth. In Gaul, the Frankish world is violent, dynamic, and deeply tied to both Roman inheritance and new royal power. Kings fight relatives as readily as enemies. Bishops record events with moral concern. Cities remain important, but power increasingly moves through networks of warriors, landholders, churches, and royal households. A climate shock here would not simply produce empty fields. It would interact with competition for land, tribute, loyalty, and sacred legitimacy. A ruler who can distribute food, protection, or plunder gains strength. A ruler who cannot may lose followers. Hunger does not replace politics, it sharpens it. Italy suffers in a particularly tragic way because it is not only exposed to climate stress but also devastated by war. The Gothic War turns parts of the peninsula into a battlefield for years. Rome, once the symbolic centre of the world, becomes a city fought over, depopulated and strained. Fields are damaged, aqueducts and urban systems suffer, civilians endure sieges, requisitions, and insecurity. When cold and poor harvest join war, hardship becomes layered. A harvest may fail because the weather is wrong, because labourers have fled, because animals have been taken, because fields are unsafe, or because supply routes have collapsed. No single explanation fully accounts for Italy's suffering, but the combination is grim. In Britain, the evidence is even more elusive. Written sources are sparse, later traditions are difficult to use, and archaeology must carry much of the burden. The 6th century is already a period of transformation after the end of Roman administration. Communities reorganize, identities shift, and new political formations emerge. Climate stress could have worsened instability, encouraged migration, altered settlement choices, or contributed to food insecurity, but caution is necessary. Britain's post-Roman changes began before 536 and continued after it. The darkened sun may have been one pressure among many, not the master explanation. Still, for families living through cold summers and uncertain harvests, the distinction between structural transformation and immediate hunger would not have mattered much. A surprising detail across Europe is how physical evidence sometimes speaks more strongly than written testimony. In regions with few chronicles, tree rings become historical documents. Pollen records can suggest changes in land use, though they are often difficult to date precisely. Archaeological layers can show whether settlements contract, move, or continue. Burials may reflect stress, disease, violence, or changing ritual practice. Hoards of buried metalwork can imply insecurity, but they can also reflect ritual deposition or wealth storage. Every clue must be handled carefully. The past does not label its evidence for our convenience. Yet the pattern of the mid-6th century remains unsettling. A cold pulse appears in natural records. Written sources in some regions describe strange skies and hardship. Archaeology in certain areas suggests disruption. Later cultural memory may preserve echoes of a world out of balance. None of this means Europe uniformly collapsed after 536. It did not. Some communities survived, adapted, even gained advantage. Crisis can destroy one group while creating opportunity for another. A kingdom with access to stored food, military power, or better land may expand while weaker neighbours contract. Disaster is rarely equal. For ordinary Europeans, hunger would have carried local names and faces. It would be the neighbour who leaves and does not return, the field no longer sown, the animal slaughtered too early, the child buried in winter ground, the village elder who remembers better summers. In a world where most people live close to subsistence, famine is not a distant category. It is the collapse of margin. The difference between enough and not enough may be one failed harvest, one sick ox, one tax demand. One raid, one cold spring, the darkened sun narrows that difference. Cold hunger also changes belief. People pray differently when seasons fail. Saints become protectors against famine, disease, storms, and war. Relics are carried. Fasts and processions take on urgent meaning. Local holy figures may gain authority by seeming to protect communities in crisis. Bishops become not only religious leaders but mediators of fear, food, and explanation. Christianity in Europe grows not in a peaceful vacuum, but in a world where divine protection feels immediately practical. When the harvest fails, theology is not abstract. It is tied to bread. The social consequences may have lasted beyond the worst years of cold. Farms abandoned during crisis are not always reoccupied. Families broken by hunger do not simply reappear when weather improves. Trade routes interrupted by insecurity may shift permanently. Elites who acquire land from desperate households may consolidate power. Communities that survive together may develop stronger local identities. Those that fail may vanish from the record so completely that their suffering becomes visible only through absence. What survives in the record suggests not one great European collapse, but many local transformations, some brutal, some subtle, some almost invisible. The phrase Europe's cold hunger captures more than temperature. It is the feeling of a continent where light, food, and confidence grow thin at the same time. The 6th century does not erase Europe, it helps remake it. Roman structures persist in some places and fade in others. New kingdoms harden, churches deepen their role. Rural power shifts. Northern societies remember, adapt, and perhaps mythologize. The old Mediterranean-centered world loses some of its gravitational pull, while regional futures become more distinct. And beneath all of this lies the same pale thread that began in the sky. The sun does not need to vanish completely to change a continent. It only needs to weaken long enough for fields to fail, for stores to empty, for rulers to demand too much, for disease to find bodies already tired, for people to begin imagining that the order of the world has cracked. In Constantinople, the crisis enters chronicles in imperial politics, in Europe's villages, forests, and cold fields. It often enters history as a narrowing ring of wood, a deserted farm, a buried hoard, a legend of winter, and the long silence of those who endured without leaving words behind. Far to the east of the Mediterranean, the same altered sky does not become the same story. Asia in the 6th century is too vast, too varied, and too politically complex to be folded into one simple tale of darkness and collapse. It contains empires, steppe confederations, oasis cities, mountain routes, rice fields, monasteries, deserts, courts, ports, and frontiers where trade and war are often difficult to separate. A volcanic veil can cross all these lands without producing identical consequences. In one region, cold may damage crops. In another, disrupted rainfall may matter more. Elsewhere, the event may leave only a faint mark in records that have survived unevenly. The evidence remains incomplete, but the wider pattern suggests that the dimming of the mid-6th century was not only a Mediterranean crisis. It belonged to a connected hemisphere. China in this period is divided, and division matters. The long unity of the Han world is gone, and before the later reunification under the Sui and Tang, northern and southern regimes compete, adapt, and inherit different pressures. In the north, states shaped by both Chinese administrative traditions and inner Asian military cultures struggle for legitimacy and control. In the south, courts preserve elite literary culture while governing landscapes with different agricultural rhythms. Political fragmentation does not mean weakness everywhere, but it means that environmental shocks are filtered through rival governments, regional economies, military needs, and local resilience. A failed season can become more dangerous when authority is contested. Some East Asian records describe unusual atmospheric and climatic phenomena around the mid-6th century, including cold, frost, or summer snow in certain years and regions. Such reports must be handled carefully. Pre-modern chronicles often organize disasters according to moral and political frameworks, and not every recorded anomaly can be tied directly to the 536 eruption. Yet when these records are compared with tree rings and broader climate reconstructions, they become part of a larger puzzle. What survives in the record suggests that parts of Asia experienced serious climatic stress during this period, though the effects varied sharply by region. Agriculture in East Asia is diverse, and that diversity can be both protection and vulnerability. Millet and wheat systems in the north respond differently to cold and drought than rice agriculture in the south. River valleys, loose plateaus, mountain margins, and coastal plains each have their own risks. A cooler year may harm one crop more than another. Abnormal rainfall may matter more than temperature alone. Governments with granary systems and transport networks can sometimes soften regional failures, but only if stores exist, roads and canals function, and officials act effectively. As in Rome, administration is powerful until scarcity exposes its limits. The steppe adds another layer. Inner Asian societies depend heavily on animals, pasture, mobility, and political alliances that can shift quickly under ecological pressure. Cold, drought, or unusual weather can damage herds, alter migration routes, intensify competition, and push groups toward raiding, alliance-making, or movement into settled zones. It would be too simple to say that one volcanic winter sent nomads crashing into empires. Steppe politics has its own logic, and scholars still debate how climate stress influences specific movements. But environmental instability can sharpen pressures in pastoral worlds with extraordinary speed. A failed pasture is the steppe equivalent of a failed field, and animals can die faster than grain stores empty. Oasis cities along the routes later known collectively as the Silk Roads occupy a particularly delicate position. Their life depends on water, trade, protection, and the ability to mediate between steppe, desert, and empire. A climate shock may not strike them first as cold alone. It may arrive as disrupted caravans, unstable patrons, shifting military routes, disease moving with merchants, or changes in the flow of goods. These places are often imagined as romantic islands of exchange, but they are also exposed nodes in a dangerous network. If distant courts weaken, if pastoral groups move, if harvests fail in surrounding regions, the oasis feels the strain. In South Asia, the story becomes even more difficult to reconstruct in a single line. The subcontinent contains monsoon systems, regional kingdoms, urban and rural economies, forest zones, coastal trade, and religious institutions that respond to climate in different ways. Volcanic aerosols can influence monsoon behavior, but the direction and severity of impact depend on many factors. Some regions may have suffered from altered rainfall, others may have been buffered. Written and archaeological evidence must be read cautiously, because political change in South Asia during this broad era cannot be reduced to one climatic episode. Still, the possibility that the mid-6th century atmospheric disturbance affected monsoon patterns remains one of the wider implications of the event. One lesser-known aspect of these Far Eastern and Southern echoes is that climate shock can influence history without leaving a dramatic disaster narrative. A court chronicle may mention an omen. A local harvest may fail without surviving text. A monastic community may relocate for reasons recorded only as patronage or decline. A trade route may shift because insecurity rises elsewhere. A dynasty may face rebellion for reasons described as political, while environmental stress sits quietly beneath the surface. The absence of a famous dark sun account in every region does not mean absence of impact. It means the impact was recorded through local languages of power, morality, and survival, or not recorded at all. The Sasanian Empire, Rome's great eastern rival, stands at the meeting point of many of these pressures. It rules across Iran and Mesopotamia, commanding agricultural zones, trade routes, cities, armies, and frontiers linked to Central Asia and the Roman world. Like Rome, it is sophisticated and resilient. Like Rome, it is expensive to maintain. Climate stress can affect Mesopotamian agriculture, tax collection, military provisioning, and frontier politics. War with Rome drains resources and creates opportunities for disease and disruption. The Sasanians do not collapse in 536, and their later fall to Arab Muslim armies in the 7th century has many causes far beyond this event. Yet the 6th century shocks form part of the long background of strain that both great empires carry into later decades. Across Asia, the altered sky also interacts with religious worlds. Buddhism moves along trade routes through Central Asia into China and beyond. Christianity, Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, local cults, and other traditions coexist, compete, and adapt across vast regions. Disasters are interpreted through these systems of meaning. A darkened sun, failed harvest, or epidemic may be read as karmic consequence, divine warning, cosmic imbalance, political omen, or local misfortune. The language changes, but the human impulse is familiar. When the heavens behave strangely, people search for moral shape in physical disorder. Modern science widens the lens again. Tree ring sequences from high mountain and northern regions of Asia can preserve signs of cooling. Ice cores show volcanic signals that reached polar archives. Climate models suggest that large eruptions can alter temperature and rainfall across broad portions of the hemisphere. None of this gives a perfect map of suffering. It does not tell us exactly which child went hungry in which village, which caravan turned back, which ruler lost legitimacy because the granaries failed. But it shows that the mid-6th century event was not trapped inside Mediterranean history. It was planetary in mechanism, even if local in experience. This wider view changes the meaning of empire. Rome and Persia were enormous in human terms, but the volcanic veil reveals a scale beyond them. The atmosphere does not recognize imperial borders. It does not pause at mountain frontiers or desert edges. It can dim light over Christian Constantinople, Zoroastrian Persia, Buddhist monasteries, steppe camps, Chinese courts, and villages with no written connection to any great power. Human societies divide the world into realms, peoples, languages, and gods. Climate moves across those divisions with indifferent ease. Yet Asia's story also warns against making the disaster too neat. Not every political change in the 6th century is caused by volcanic cooling. Not every famine belongs to 536. Not every migration can be traced to a cold summer. The evidence remains incomplete, and responsible history must leave room for uncertainty. What can be said is that a major atmospheric disturbance entered an already dynamic Asian world, where divided states, pastoral frontiers, trade networks, religious change, and agricultural systems were all in motion. In some places, it may have deepened crisis. In others, it may have passed as a strange season remembered only briefly. In still others, it may have contributed to transformations that no surviving source explains directly. The same veil that makes the sun pale over Constantinople therefore stretches into a much larger human geography. It touches farmers whose crops depend on monsoon timing, herders watching pasture under a hostile sky, monks copying texts by uncertain light, officials recording anomalies as warnings to rulers, merchants measuring risk along caravan roads, and soldiers stationed on frontiers where weather can decide the difference between patrol and disaster. Their experiences are not identical, but they belong to the same disturbed atmosphere. Asia beneath the same veil reminds us that history is often written from centers of surviving text. While disaster itself travels through centers and margins alike, Constantinople gives the story a dramatic imperial face. Europe gives it cold fields, narrow rings, and possible mythic echoes. Asia gives it scale. The darkened sun was not merely a Roman omen, nor only a European winter memory. It was part of a hemispheric disturbance, felt through many climates, many states, many beliefs, and many silences. The sun weakened above a world far larger than any emperor's map, and beneath it, countless societies made their own uneasy calculations about food, power, movement, and survival. Beyond Eurasia, the darkened sun becomes harder to follow, not because the atmosphere stops at the edge of the known chronicles, but because the records change. The farther the story moves from the literate courts and monasteries that wrote about dim skies, the more it must rely on other kinds of traces: tree rings, lake sediments, ice chemistry, settlement patterns, crop remains, abandoned spaces, and the long, difficult work of archaeological interpretation. The Americas do not give this event a single famous witness standing under a pale noon and describing the sun as weak. Yet if the eruption was powerful enough to alter climate across much of the northern hemisphere, its echoes may have reached lands whose histories were recorded in earth, wood, water, and memory rather than in the chronicles of Rome. The Americas in the 6th century are not empty margins of world history. They are full of societies with their own cities, farms, trade routes, ritual landscapes, political experiments, and environmental challenges. In Mesoamerica, Maya cities are rising, competing, building monuments, and shaping dense political worlds long before the later classic Maya collapse. In the Andes, complex societies are developing in landscapes where altitude, irrigation, coast, and highland exchange create both opportunity and risk. Across North America, communities farm, hunt, gather, trade, mound build, fish, manage landscapes, and adapt to local climates with deep knowledge. None of these worlds is waiting for Eurasia to define history. They are living their own. If volcanic aerosols affected temperature, rainfall, or growing seasons across parts of the Americas, the consequences would have depended sharply on region. Maize farmers in one area might suffer from shortened seasons or drought. Highland communities might experience cold in ways lowland communities did not. Coastal societies could lean more heavily on marine resources if agriculture faltered, while inland groups might depend on stored crops, wild foods, or movement. Tropical regions may have been less affected by cooling alone but more sensitive to rainfall shifts. No single explanation fully accounts for what such a climate shock would mean across two continents. The Americas are not one landscape, they are thousands. This is why caution matters. It would be irresponsible to claim that the dimming of 536 caused a clear collapse across the Americas. The evidence remains incomplete, and many cultural changes in the 6th century have local explanations that do not require a distant eruption. Archaeological chronologies are often too broad to tie a shift precisely to 1 year. A settlement may be abandoned over decades. A drought may be regional. Political change may result from conflict, trade, ideology, or leadership rather than climate. But caution does not mean silence. It means looking carefully for possible echoes without forcing them into a story they may not belong to. In Mesoamerica, the 6th century sits within a period of intense development. Great centers such as Teotihuacan had already shaped a vast sphere of influence, and Maya polities were becoming increasingly complex. These societies depend on agriculture, but also on water management, trade, ritual authority, and political competition. Climate stress here would not simply mean crops fail and cities empty. It could alter the credibility of rulers whose power is tied to ritual order and agricultural fertility. It could sharpen competition between centers. It could make stored food, water access, and control of trade more important. Scholars still debate many details of Mesoamerican climate history. But the broader principle is clear: environmental stress becomes political when leaders are expected to mediate between people, gods, and survival. In the Andes, the relationship between climate and society is even more vertically complex. Communities can use ecological zones stacked by altitude, coast, valley, highland, and puna. This creates resilience because different zones produce different foods and resources. It also creates dependency on exchange. A climatic disturbance affecting one zone may be buffered by another, but only if exchange networks remain stable. Cold can damage highland agriculture and herding. Rainfall shifts can threaten irrigation systems on the coast. El Niño events, droughts, or floods can reshape local histories in ways that may overlap with or obscure volcanic signals. What survives in the record suggests that Andean societies were skilled at adaptation, yet skill does not erase vulnerability. Farther north, in what is now the American Southwest, eastern woodlands, plains, and Arctic regions, the range of lifeways is immense. Some communities cultivate maize, beans, squash, and other crops. Others rely heavily on hunting, fishing, gathering, or mixed strategies. In the Arctic and subarctic, small changes in temperature, sea ice, animal migration, or seasonal timing can be highly consequential. In temperate regions, growing seasons and rainfall matter deeply. Tree ring records in parts of North America can preserve evidence of climatic anomalies, but linking any one anomaly to the 536 event requires careful chronology and regional study. The shadow may be visible in the data, but not always in a way that tells a human story by itself. A lesser-known point is that climate shocks sometimes leave their strongest mark not as abandonment, but as reorganization. A community may move a village to better land. It may change crop emphasis. It may rely more on hunting for a generation. It may intensify storage, irrigation, trade, or ritual activity. It may build alliances or fortifications. To a later archaeologist, this can look like cultural change rather than disaster. In truth, it may be both. Human adaptation can hide suffering because successful survival leaves fewer dramatic ruins than failure. The Pacific also belongs in this wider field of distant echoes. Island societies live with an especially intimate awareness of climate, ocean, storms, reefs, fish, rainfall, and soil. A volcanic veil that shifts weather patterns could affect voyaging, crop yields, fresh water, or marine resources, though the evidence for 6th century impacts varies and remains difficult to pin down. Across the Pacific, as in the Americas, societies are not passive recipients of environmental change. They read winds, currents, plants, birds, stars, and seasons with extraordinary skill. But even skilled knowledge can be challenged when the sky behaves outside memory. What makes these distant possibilities important is not that they prove a universal collapse. They do not. Their importance lies in scale. The 536 event reminds us that ancient history is often too narrowly framed by surviving written empires. Rome writes, so Rome becomes central. China records, so China becomes visible. Monasteries preserve notes, so monastic anxieties travel across time. But the atmosphere did not choose literate societies as its only audience. A child in a Maya farming household, a herder in the Andes, a hunter near a northern forest, a fisher on a cold coast, and a villager in the Pacific could all experience unusual seasons without leaving a sentence behind. For modern researchers, this creates a difficult task. Natural archives can reveal climate signals, but human meaning must be reconstructed cautiously. Lake sediments may show erosion, drought, or vegetation change. Pollen can suggest shifts in land use. Charcoal can hint at fire regimes. Isotopes can reveal diet or water stress. Burials can show health, trauma, or changing ritual. None of these clues alone says, the sun disappeared, but together, in some places, they may suggest that distant communities adjusted to a world briefly pushed out of balance. The Americas and other distant regions also complicate the idea of collapse. In popular imagination, collapse often means a dramatic ruin, a city emptied, a dynasty broken, a people vanished. But many societies respond to crisis by dispersing, merging, migrating, changing rituals, shifting authority, or adopting new subsistence patterns. From the outside, this may look like disappearance. From within, it is survival under new terms. The 6th century atmospheric shock may have contributed to such terms in certain places, even where no empire fell and no chronicler wrote of darkness. The evidence remains incomplete, and it is better to say that the event's distant echoes are plausible in some regions and uncertain in many others. That uncertainty is not disappointing. It is honest. It preserves the difference between what is known, what is inferred, and what remains beyond reach. Yet even uncertainty has power here. It forces the imagination outward, away from capitals and kings, toward a planet of communities living beneath one altered sky. By the time the volcanic veil thins and light begins to recover, its effects have already passed through countless local worlds. Some absorbed it and continued. Some may have changed course. Some left signs only specialists can read. Some left nothing that survives. The day the sun disappeared was never only a day and never only one civilization's disaster. It was a reminder that human histories, however separate they seem, unfold inside the same atmosphere and across oceans, forests, mountains, deserts, and islands. That atmosphere carried a message no one could answer. Directly the light can fail, and every society must discover what it is made of when it does. Long after the sky clears, darkness can remain in memory. It does not always remain as a date. Dates belong to scribes, courts, chronicles, and later historians who organize fear into numbered years. Ordinary people often remember disaster differently. They remember the winter that would not end, the summer that never warmed, the harvest that failed, the strange colour of the sun, the graves dug too quickly, the animals slaughtered before their time, the road filled with strangers looking for food. As generations pass, these memories change shape. They become warnings, sacred stories, omens, fragments of legend, and images of a world once pushed toward its edge. A failing sun is one of the oldest and most powerful images human beings possess. It appears in religious imagination, royal ideology, myth, ritual, and apocalyptic expectation, because sunlight is not simply brightness, it is order made visible. When the sun rises, the world seems confirmed. When it weakens, people feel that confirmation slipping. In the 6th century, the dimming of the sun entered cultures already prepared to interpret the heavens. A strange sky could mean divine anger, moral corruption, the death of a ruler, the turning of an age, or a warning that hidden disorder had become cosmic. The physical event was atmospheric, the human event was symbolic. In Christian late antiquity, darkness in the heavens could carry immense theological weight. Scripture, preaching, liturgy, and popular belief all gave meaning to signs in the sky. A darkened sun might recall judgment, repentance, or the fragility of earthly power. Bishops and monks did not treat nature as meaningless background. They saw the created world as morally charged, capable of reflecting divine displeasure or calling people back to humility. This does not mean that every writer responded with panic or superstition. Many ancient observers were careful and restrained, but even restraint existed inside a universe where abnormal light demanded interpretation. In other regions, different symbolic systems shaped the memory of disrupted seasons. In parts of East Asia, unusual celestial and atmospheric events could be recorded as omens connected to rulership and moral order. In steppe and pastoral worlds, harsh winters and dying herds could enter heroic tradition as tests of endurance, legitimacy, and fate. In northern Europe, memories of extreme cold may have fed later images of cosmic winter. Though scholars still debate how direct that connection can be, the evidence remains incomplete, and myth cannot be treated as a simple weather report. Yet myths often preserve emotional truths even when they blur chronology. They remember what a disaster felt like after the details have dissolved. The idea of Fimbulwinter is especially tempting because it sounds almost too close to the 6th century experience, a terrible winter before the end of the world, a breakdown of warmth, order, and kinship, but caution is essential. The surviving Norse mythological sources were written down centuries after 536 in Christian medieval Iceland, preserving and reshaping older traditions through layers of memory, poetry, and interpretation. It would be careless to say that Fimbulwinter is a direct record of the volcanic winter. Still, in Scandinavia, where archaeological evidence suggests serious disruption in the mid-6th century, the possibility of a distant memory is difficult to dismiss entirely. What survives may not be a photograph of the event, but an echo of cold catastrophe transformed into cosmology. This transformation from event to myth is not a failure of memory. It is one of memory's methods. Human communities do not preserve every hardship as a neutral list of causes. They ask what it means. They bind disaster to moral order, ancestry, gods, saints, heroes, kings, and endings. A famine becomes a lesson about pride. A plague becomes punishment or trial. A darkened sun becomes a sign that the world itself has spoken. Modern readers may be tempted to strip away these meanings and keep only the climate data, but doing so would miss how people actually lived the event. They did not experience aerosols. They experienced dread. There is a lesser-known survival of disaster in ritual behavior. When communities face failed harvests, strange weather, or disease, they may intensify processions, fasting, offerings, prayers, relic veneration, or acts of public repentance. Such rituals are not merely symbolic decoration. They are social technologies of crisis. They gather people, organize fear, assign meaning, and create the feeling that action is still possible when ordinary tools fail. A procession cannot clear volcanic sulfate from the stratosphere, but it can bind a frightened town into a shared response. It can also reinforce authority, whether of bishops, rulers, elders, or ritual specialists. Chronicles preserve another kind of memory compressed, moralized, and selective. A writer may place a darkened sun beside famine, war, earthquake, or plague, because these events together seem to reveal the character of an age. This clustering can frustrate modern historians who want exact sequence and causation, but it reveals something important about perception. To those living through a decade of overlapping disasters, the distinction between atmospheric anomaly, crop failure, disease, and political crisis may have mattered less than the sense that the world had entered a period of disorder. The chronicle turns that feeling into structure. Over time, the memory of the darkened sun may also have faded where recovery was stronger. Communities that survived and rebuilt did not necessarily keep telling the story with equal urgency. New rulers needed new myths. New wars replaced old fears. Children born after the crisis knew the event only from elders. A century later, the dim sun might survive as a strange note in a manuscript, a local legend, a ritual whose origin was half forgotten, or not at all. The planet remembered in ice and trees more faithfully than many human communities could. Earth's archives are cold, but they do not get bored. Humans must choose what to carry. Yet some images are too powerful to vanish completely. The failing sun belongs to that category. It appears again and again across human cultures because it speaks to a basic vulnerability. Civilizations may build walls, calendars, temples, observatories, granaries, and laws, but they cannot compel dawn to be warm. When light itself becomes uncertain, every system beneath it feels provisional. That is why stories of darkened skies cling to apocalyptic imagination. They do not need exact science to be profound. They express the terror of dependence. Modern reconstructions add another layer to this memory. Today, when researchers identify the 536 event through ice cores and tree rings, they are not merely solving an old puzzle. They are restoring scale to human testimony. The chronicler who described a dim sun becomes linked to a tree that grew poorly in a cold summer, to sulfur trapped in Greenland ice, to distant societies that may have adjusted without writing a word. Ancient memory and scientific memory join, each correcting the other. Text gives fear a voice, science gives fear a mechanism. Still, the cultural legacy of 536 remains difficult to measure. It did not produce one universal myth shared by all affected peoples. It did not become a single-name catastrophe remembered everywhere. Its legacy is scattered possible echoes in northern myth, ominous notes in chronicles, intensified religious interpretations, altered settlement histories, and perhaps deeper habits of thinking about cold, famine, and divine warning. The evidence remains incomplete, and some proposed links are more suggestive than proven, but the absence of a single global legend does not weaken the event's significance. It reminds us that memory is local, even when climate is not. There is also a moral danger in making ancient people seem naive because they explain disaster through signs. In truth, modern societies still search for meaning when systems fail. We may speak of supply chains, aerosols, pathogens, and climate forcing, but we also ask who is to blame, what the disaster reveals, whether our institutions are just, whether our way of life is more fragile than we believed. The 6th century world read the darkened sun through gods and judgment. We read it through science and risk. Both readings arise from the same human need to make terror intelligible. The myths of a failing sun therefore belong not only to the past, they are part of the long human effort to remember that order is conditional. A pale sky in 536 becomes a chronicle entry, a cold ring in a tree, a possible winter at the edge of a legend, a warning folded into theology, a puzzle for researchers, and a mirror for later civilizations. It tells us that catastrophe is never only what happens. It is also what people think has happened to the meaning of the world. And so, as the light slowly returns, the memory of its absence begins another journey. It moves from field to story, from hunger to prayer, from fear to myth, from manuscript to laboratory. The sun strengthens again, but the idea that it once failed remains. Somewhere in that memory is the deepest wound of the darkened year, not only that crops died or empires weakened, but that people discovered the sky could become unfamiliar. Once that thought enters a culture, it does not entirely leave. It waits beneath later stories of winter, judgment, plague, and ending, a quiet reminder that even daylight has a history. To say that the sun disappeared and empires collapsed is powerful, but it's also dangerous if taken too literally. History rarely breaks in a single clean moment. Empires do not fall like stones from a roof because one event pushes them. They weaken, adjust, harden, reform, lose territory, gain territory, transform their institutions, abandon old dreams, invent new ones, and sometimes continue under names that make their survival hard for later generations to recognize. The darkened sun of 536 belongs to the story of collapse, but it also belongs to the story of transformation. The difference matters. By the middle of the 6th century, the ancient world is already moving away from the shape it once had. The Western Roman imperial structure has gone, but Roman culture, law, religion, landholding, and urban memory survive in uneven forms. The Eastern Roman Empire still stands, yet it is becoming something more medieval in its pressures, more defensive in its long-term posture, and more tightly bound to Christian imperial identity. Persia remains powerful, but it too carries the cost of long rivalry and internal strain. Across Europe, new kingdoms are not simply ruins of Rome, they are political experiments blending Roman inheritance, military lordship, local law, and Christian authority. The world is not ending, it is changing categories. The climate shock and plague accelerate some of these changes, but they do not explain all of them. Justinian's wars would have been costly even under clear skies. The theological divisions of the empire did not begin with volcanic dust. The tension between great landowners and small producers was older than the dim sun. Trade networks had been shifting for generations. The Sasanian-Roman rivalry had deep roots. The rise of new powers in Europe and Asia cannot be reduced to failed harvests. No single explanation fully accounts for the 6th century's transformation, and any story that claims otherwise flattens the past into a fable. Yet rejecting a single cause explanation does not make the darkened sun unimportant. It means its importance must be understood as pressure. The volcanic winter presses on systems already burdened. It reduces harvest when states need revenue. It weakens bodies before plague. It strains supply lines during war. It makes rulers look less capable in a world where legitimacy depends on order. It deepens the emotional sense that the age is unstable. It closes possibilities that might otherwise have remained open. The disaster is not the whole engine of change, but it changes the fuel, the speed, and the direction. For Justinian, this distinction is crucial. His reign is not a failure in any simple sense. His legal reforms shape history for centuries. Hagia Sophia becomes one of the greatest monuments of late antique and medieval civilization. North Africa is restored to imperial rule for a time. Roman power in the Mediterranean briefly expands in ways that would have seemed impossible only decades earlier. And yet the restoration does not become permanent renewal. Italy is devastated. The empire's resources are drained. Plague and climate shock reduce the margin for success. The dream survives as achievement and warning at the same time. This is often how collapse really works. It is not always the sudden disappearance of a people. More often, it is the failure of a future. A society continues, but the path it seemed to be walking closes. Justinian's empire survives, but the old Roman Mediterranean cannot be fully rebuilt. Cities continue, but some shrink or lose functions they once had. Farmers continue, but landholding and obligation shift. Trade continues, but routes and volumes change. The state continues, but under heavier military and fiscal pressure. From inside the moment, people may not say their civilization has collapsed. They may say taxes are harsher, roads less safe, bread more expensive, winters stranger, relatives dead, and opportunities fewer. The same is true in Europe. The 6th century crises do not erase the Franks, Goths, Britons, Scandinavians, or others. They reshape the conditions in which power is built. In some places, weak communities disappear from the record while stronger elites consolidate land and authority. In others, crisis may encourage localism, militarization, religious dependence, or migration. The old Roman urban world fades unevenly, not because one dark year destroys every city, but because war, disease, fiscal change, political fragmentation, and environmental stress make old urban systems harder to maintain. Collapse, here, looks like contraction and reorientation. In Scandinavia, if the mid-6th century disruption was as severe as some evidence suggests, it may have helped transform social structures, settlement patterns, and elite culture. But even there, the result is not simple emptiness. Later northern societies emerge with new forms of power, memory, and myth. A catastrophe can become the buried foundation of a later identity. What looks like an ending from one angle may be preparation from another. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the scale of disruption. But the broader lesson stands: survival often wears the mask of disappearance, because the old form is gone. Asia offers the same caution on a larger scale. Chinese states continue through division toward eventual reunification. Steppe powers rise and fall through dynamics that include climate, but are not ruled by it alone. South Asian and Central Asian societies adapt within their own political and environmental worlds. Persia remains formidable long after 536, yet the accumulated shocks of war, plague, and internal strain form part of the background to later vulnerability. Climate does not write destiny. It changes the terms under which human choices are made. A lesser-known but vital point is that resilience itself can be costly. When a state survives disaster by raising taxes, militarizing society, tightening control over labor, or concentrating resources in fewer hands, survival may deepen long-term inequality. When a village survives by selling land to a powerful estate, the village continues, but freedom narrows. When a family survives by consuming seed grain, the next year becomes poorer. When an empire survives by abandoning distant ambitions, the map becomes smaller but more defensible. Resilience is not always recovery. Sometimes it is the art of losing less. This helps explain why ancient collapse is so difficult to see clearly. Some ruins are obvious: a burned city, an abandoned villa, a broken aqueduct, a deserted farm. But many transformations leave ambiguous traces. A community moves from stone buildings to timber. Is that decline, adaptation, or both a city's population shrinks? Is that plague, war, economic shift, changing political importance, or altogether imported pottery declines? Is trade collapsing, or are people using local goods? Burial customs change. Is that religious transformation, migration, poverty, or choice? The evidence remains incomplete because human life is more complicated than the categories left behind. The darkened sun sits at the center of these ambiguities. It is dramatic enough to attract attention, but subtle enough in its social effects to resist simple measurement. We can see the sulfate in ice. We can see narrow tree rings. We can read descriptions of a dim sun. We can trace famine, plague, war, and political strain. But connecting all of this into exact cause and effect is difficult. The best interpretation is not that 536 single-handedly toppled empires. It is that 536 and the shocks around it exposed the dependence of empires on environmental stability, and then magnified existing crises at a critical moment. That may be more frightening than a simple collapse story. A single-cause disaster can be imagined as rare and distant. A compounded crisis feels closer to the truth of human vulnerability. Societies are usually not destroyed by one blow when all else is strong. They are endangered when several systems fail to gather: climate, food, health, trust, finance, leadership, belief, and security. The 6th century shows that these systems are not separate. A sky full of volcanic haze can become a tax crisis. A harvest failure can become military weakness. A disease outbreak can become theological fear. A war can become famine. Collapse is not an event so much as a conversation among pressures. And transformation is that same conversation continuing after the worst has passed. The survivors rebuild, but not exactly what was lost. They remember some things and forget others. They create institutions suited to a harsher world. They move authority from cities to estates, from secular offices to churches, from imperial dreams to regional powers, from old trade habits to new local economies. They carry forward fragments of Rome, Persia, Germanic kingship, Christian theology, steppe politics, village custom, and ecological memory. The world after the darkened sun is not empty, it is rearranged. So the question is not simply whether empires collapsed. Some did not. Some weakened. Some transformed. Some ambitions collapsed while institutions survived. Some populations suffered terribly while ruling names continued. Some regions lost complexity, others gained opportunity. The day the sun disappeared becomes historically important not because it offers one neat answer, but because it reveals how fragile the boundary is between continuity and breakdown. The ancient world under that pale light teaches a hard lesson. Civilization is not only what people build, but what conditions allow those buildings to keep meaning. Walls need defenders. Defenders need food. Food needs seasons. Seasons depend on planetary systems beyond any ruler's control. When those systems shift, the strongest empire may still stand, but it stands differently. Its future narrows. Its promises become harder to keep. And its people learn that collapse can arrive not as an ending, but as a transformation they must live through day by day. The light returns slowly, not like a curtain lifted in triumph, but like a patient recovery after fever. The sun strengthens. Seasons begin to behave more recognizably. Fields that survived are planted again. Animals breed again. Ships continue to move. Children born after the worst years grow up under skies that seem ordinary to them, because ordinary is whatever the living inherit. The world does not end. That is one of the most important truths of the darkened year. The sun weakens. Harvests fail, plague enters, wars grind on, and still human beings continue making bread, law, prayer, shelter, memory, and plans. But survival is not the same as returning unchanged. The ancient world after the mid-6th century carries scars that are not always visible in monuments. Some villages are smaller. Some lands have changed hands. Some families have vanished from inheritance lines. Some cities have lost population, confidence, or wealth. Some trade routes continue, but with altered rhythms. Some rulers still speak in the old language of command, yet the ground beneath command has shifted. What survives in the record suggests a world that endures unevenly, with pockets of recovery beside zones of deep damage. The light returns to everyone, but not everyone has the same strength left to meet it. In Constantinople, the empire goes on. This alone is remarkable. The Eastern Roman state survives the dimming, the famine, the plague, the wars, and the crushing expense of Justinian's ambitions. It remains a major power for centuries. It preserves Roman law, Christian imperial culture, administrative skill, diplomacy, and military adaptation. Yet the empire that survives is not the empire Justinian dreamed of restoring. The Mediterranean does not return permanently to old Roman unity. Italy is damaged. The Western campaigns cost more than they can securely give back. Persia remains a rival. Later Arab-Muslim conquests will transform the Eastern Mediterranean in ways no one under the pale sun of 536 could yet foresee. The empire survives, but the future has narrowed and changed direction. Elsewhere, the same pattern repeats in different forms. Europe does not vanish into darkness. It reorganizes. Kingdoms harden. Churches become deeper anchors of community and authority. Rural power grows in importance. Some cities fade, others persist. Northern societies absorb disruption, and later produce new forms of culture, power, and myth. Across Asia, states rise, fall, reunify, and transform within their own timelines, carrying the memory of climate stress only where records or traditions preserve it. In many places, the disaster leaves no named legacy, only subtle changes in settlement, economy, health, or belief. The evidence remains incomplete, and perhaps it always will. Much of the human cost was never written down. What remains clearest is the lesson of dependence. The 6th century crisis reveals that civilizations are never sealed machines. They are open systems, breathing through fields, forests, rivers, animals, microbes, winds, oceans, and sunlight. A ruler can command soldiers, but not summer. A law can define obligation, but not make grain ripen. A city can build walls against armies, but not against particles drifting invisibly through the stratosphere. The strongest institutions are still biological in their foundations. They require bodies healthy enough to work, crops reliable enough to store, animals strong enough to pull, and seasons stable enough to trust. The fragile light returns, but the memory of its failure remains scattered. In manuscripts, it survives as strange testimony. In ice, it survives as sulfate. In trees, it survives as narrow growth. In archaeology, it may survive as abandonment, contraction, or reorganization. In myth, perhaps, it survives as a winter before the end of the world. None of these witnesses is complete. Together, they form a kind of broken mirror. In it, we see not only the 6th century, but the deeper truth that history is shaped by forces both human and more than human. The day the sun disappeared was never truly a single day. It was a season, a decade, a chain of consequences, a wound in expectation. It did not simply topple empires, but it made empires prove what they were made of. Some endured, some weakened, some changed so deeply that later generations mistook transformation for disappearance. Beneath the returning sun, survivors rebuilt the world in altered form, carrying forward less certainty than before. And perhaps that is the quiet terror at the heart of the story. The sun came back, the world continued. But those who had lived under the dim sky now knew something that could not be unknown. The order of nature, like the order of kingdoms, was not guaranteed. The Wind Down begins with a quieter image, not an emperor, not a battlefield, not a city struck by plague, but a field after the crisis has passed. The grain is growing again. The light has softened into something familiar. A farmer bends to the soil, perhaps thinking of weather, debt, family, and seed, not of volcanic aerosols or the fate of empires. The sky above him looks ordinary. That ordinariness is precious because it has been lost before. History often remembers collapse through ruins, but much of human survival happens in places that leave almost no trace. A repaired roof, a replanted field, a child carried through hunger, a road used again after fear has emptied it, a prayer said not in panic, but in gratitude that morning has come with warmth. These small continuities are easy to overlook, yet they are the reason the world continues after disaster. The year 536 and the crises that followed remind us that civilization is both astonishing and delicate. It can build domes, codes of law, trade networks, kingdoms, and sacred stories. It can cross seas and preserve memory for centuries, but it still lives beneath the sky. It still waits for rain. It still trusts the sun. And when that trust is broken, even briefly, the strongest powers discover the limits of command. What remains now is not the darkness itself, but its trace, a pale line in ice, a thin ring in wood, a sentence in a chronicle, a possible echo in myth, a question that scholars still follow through chemistry, climate, archaeology, and text. The ancient people who looked up at the dimmed sun did not know that the earth was keeping evidence for us. They only knew that the day had lost its brightness, and that the world felt suddenly less certain. The light returned, as light does, grass-covered ruins. New rulers spoke old titles. Children grew into stories they had not witnessed. The strange sky became memory, then fragment, then mystery. But somewhere beneath all later history, that dim year remains a reminder that time is deep, power is temporary, and even the sun, for a little while, can seem to fade.